Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight, we're easing into a question that feels ancient and immediate at the same time. A thought that has a way of surfacing when the world grows quiet and distractions finally loosen their grip. This is not a question built on urgency or fear, and it isn't meant to provoke alarm or certainty. It's simply an idea worth sitting with for a while, slowly, patiently, without rushing toward conclusions. Before we begin, settle in however you like. Maybe the lights are already low. Maybe there's a familiar background sound in the room, a fan, distant traffic, the quiet rhythm of a building at rest. If you find this kind of exploration calming, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe, but only if it genuinely adds something to your evening. And wherever you're listening from, at whatever hour this finds you, you're part of a long tradition of people wondering about their place in a much larger story. Tonight, we're not asking whether the Anunnaki existed in the way modern theories often describe. We're not revisiting arguments about ancient astronauts, hidden planets, or lost technologies. Instead, we're stepping into something quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling. What if the Anunnaki, as they appear in the oldest texts, never truly left the human story at all? Not through dramatic disappearances or celestial departures, but through something far more subtle. What if watching never required being seen? In the popular imagination, presence is loud. Power announces itself. Influence demands symbols, monuments, and constant reminders. We expect control to come with visibility, with structures we can point to and identify. But the Sumerian texts, when read carefully and without modern expectations layered on top, suggest a very different relationship between divine authority and human awareness. They describe beings who did not rule through spectacle alone, and who did not always need temples filled with worshippers to remain relevant to the world below. In the earliest layers of Mesopotamian writing, the gods are not distant abstractions. They are woven into daily life, into agriculture, law, weather, illness, and survival itself. Their presence is assumed rather than debated. But as time moves forward through the tablets, something shifts. The gods do not vanish, yet they become harder to locate. Their actions grow indirect, their voices quieter, their decisions still shape outcomes, but the mechanisms become less visible, less personal, and harder to trace. This shift is often interpreted as religious evolution. As societies grow more complex, belief systems change. Gods retreat into symbolism. Myths replace memories. That explanation is neat, comfortable, and largely sufficient for academic discussion. But the texts themselves leave room for another possibility, one that doesn't contradict scholarship but exists alongside it in the margins where certainty fades, the possibility that absence is not the same thing as departure. The Anunnaki, in their original context, were not wandering visitors searching for resources or conquest. They were part of a structured divine system, associated with authority, judgment, and the maintenance of order beneath the surface of the world. They were not the most visible gods, nor the most approachable. Their role was not to teach humanity how to build or farm, but to observe, to weigh, to decide when balance had shifted too far in one direction. What happens to beings whose primary function is oversight when direct intervention becomes unnecessary or even counterproductive? In human systems, we see this constantly. The most effective forms of control often become invisible over time. Laws become habits. Surveillance becomes normalized. Authority no longer needs to announce itself because behavior has already adjusted around it. The Sumerians did not describe a moment when the Anunnaki declared their withdrawal. There is no tablet that records a final farewell, no ceremony marking the end of divine oversight. Instead, the record simply grows quieter on the subject. Mentions become rarer. Roles become more symbolic. Responsibility disperses. The world continues, but something foundational has subtly changed. This is where the question begins to take shape, not as speculation, but as a pattern. If the Anunnaki were never rulers in the way modern imagination portrays them, but observers and judges operating within a cosmic system of balance, then visibility was never their primary tool. Presence did not require constant interaction. Influence did not depend on belief. In that framework, the idea of still watching does not imply constant interference or daily involvement. It suggests something closer to long-term observation, the kind that waits for thresholds rather than reacting to individual events. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize cycles, limits, and boundaries. When humanity crossed certain lines, consequences followed, not immediately, not predictably, but decisively. Flood myths are often read as moral stories or exaggerated memories of natural disasters, but within the internal logic of Sumerian cosmology, they represent resets. Moments when observation turned into action, because balance could no longer be maintained passively. Between those moments, long stretches of quiet unfold, where humanity operates largely on its own, believing itself unobserved, unjudged, and autonomous. From a modern perspective, this feels uncomfortably familiar. We live in an age where observation is constant but rarely felt. Systems record, analyze, and evaluate behavior without announcing themselves. The watcher does not need to intervene to exert influence. The possibility alone is enough to shape outcomes. This parallel does not suggest ancient beings operating modern technology. It suggests that certain dynamics of power and oversight are timeless. Whether divine, institutional, or abstract, observation works best when it fades into the background of daily life. The Anunnaki, as remembered by the Sumerians, belonged to the underworld not because they were evil, but because their domain was hidden, beneath the surface, beyond immediate perception. Judgment does not require proximity. It requires distance. It requires patience. It requires time measured differently than human lifespans allow. If such beings were still watching, the signs would not be dramatic. There would be no lights in the sky, no sudden revelations, no clear evidence demanding recognition. Observation, by its nature, avoids disruption. It allows systems to reveal themselves honestly, without the distortion caused by interference. Human history, viewed from this angle, becomes less a story of abandonment and more a prolonged test of autonomy. What does a species do when it believes no one is paying attention? How does it organize power, resources, and survival when it assumes there will be no correction from above or below? The Sumerians believed that fate was fixed, but not arbitrary. It was determined through processes that unfolded over time, influenced by behavior, accumulation, and imbalance. The Anunnaki were not enforcers of morality in a human sense. They were administrators of consequence. That distinction matters. Morality demands intention and awareness. Consequence requires only action and outcome. Watching, in this context, is not about approval or condemnation. It is about record-keeping, about noting patterns, about waiting until systems reach points where intervention becomes unavoidable. As civilizations rose and fell, as empires expanded and collapsed, as humanity reshaped its environment in increasingly irreversible ways, the Sumerian worldview would suggest that observation continued quietly in the background, not because humanity was special, but because it was influential, capable of altering balances that extended beyond itself. From this perspective, the absence of divine presence is not reassuring. It is neutral. It implies allowance, not protection. Freedom, not safety. A watched world is not a guided one. It is a world allowed to reveal its priorities without interruption. This idea doesn't require belief to function. It doesn't ask for worship or fear. It simply reframes the silence that followed the earliest myths. Instead of seeing it as forgetfulness or metaphor, it treats it as intentional distance. As the texts move forward in time, human responsibility increases. Kings rule without direct divine instruction. laws are written and enforced by human institutions, temples become symbolic centres rather than points of communication. The divine does not disappear, but it stops explaining itself, and that silence, more than any declaration, is what gives the question its weight. What if watching was always meant to feel like nothing at all? The story doesn't end here, and it isn't meant to. This opening is not a conclusion or a claim. It's simply the first slow step into a pattern that stretches across thousands of years of human memory, where presence fades, observation remains, and certainty becomes something humans supply for themselves. The quiet continues, and with it the space to look a little closer at what it means when ancient oversight doesn't announce its absence, but simply steps back and lets the world move forward on its own. When we talk about gods leaving, disappearing, or withdrawing from the world, we're already using language that assumes a clear moment of separation. A departure implies an announcement, a final action, some visible change that marks before and after. But when the oldest Sumerian texts are read slowly, without modern expectations pressed onto them, something immediately becomes clear. They never describe such a moment. There is no tablet that records the gods packing up their authority and stepping away from the world. There is no closing scene, no final withdrawal, no clear boundary where divine presence ends and human autonomy begins. Instead, there is continuity, followed by silence, and that distinction matters more than it first appears. The earliest layers of Sumerian writing were not created as mythology in the way we use the word today. They were administrative, ritual, legal, and practical. Gods appear in them not as distant symbols, but as active participants in how reality functioned. They assigned roles, distributed responsibility, established order, and responded to imbalance. Their presence was assumed in the same way gravity or seasons were assumed. Not debated, not questioned, not defended. It simply was. What's striking is not how prominent the gods are in the earliest texts, but how casually they appear. There is no sense of awe-struck storytelling in those first records. No effort to convince the reader that these beings exist. The scribes wrote as if everyone already understood the framework. The gods were not extraordinary visitors. They were part of the operating system of the world. As time moves forward through the textual record, something subtle begins to shift. The gods do not vanish from the tablets. Their names continue to appear. Their authority is still acknowledged, but the nature of their involvement changes. They stop acting as immediate managers of daily reality and begin functioning more as distant guarantors of order. The shift is gradual enough that it's easy to miss unless you're specifically looking for it. This is where modern interpretations often introduce the idea of departure. Because we expect stories to explain transitions clearly, we assume that silence means absence. But ancient cultures did not think that way. Silence was not emptiness. It was restraint. It was distance. It was the space between action and consequence. The Anunnaki are a perfect example of this misunderstanding. In the earliest references, they are not described as creators, engineers, or teachers. They are associated with authority, judgment, and fate. Their domain is not the visible world of cities and temples, but the underlying structure that determines outcomes. They appear when limits are reached, when balance must be restored, when decisions carry irreversible weight. As centuries pass, mentions of the Anunnaki become less frequent. This is often explained as mythological evolution, as later cultures reworking earlier beliefs into symbolic frameworks. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What it does not address is why certain roles fade while others persist. The gods associated with daily life remain prominent. Storms, fertility, war, and kingship continue to receive divine attribution, but the figures associated with judgment and oversight recede into the background. That pattern suggests not abandonment, but delegation. When systems stabilize, oversight becomes less visible. Authority does not need to intervene constantly when rules are internalized and structures are self-perpetuating. In human societies, the same pattern occurs repeatedly. Early governance is direct and personal. Later governance becomes bureaucratic, abstract, and distant. The Sumerians themselves hint at this shift without ever explaining it outright. In the earliest periods, kingship is described as descending from heaven. Rule is explicitly divine in origin. Kings act as intermediaries, not autonomous leaders. Over time, kingship becomes hereditary, institutionalized, and justified through tradition rather than direct divine mandate. The gods are still acknowledged, but they no longer speak through every decision. This transition is not framed as rebellion or loss, it is presented as maturation. Humanity taking on more responsibility within a world that remains structured, but no longer micromanaged. The gods do not leave, they step back. What modern readers often miss is that the texts never describe this as a positive or negative development. It is treated as inevitable. The world becomes noisier, more complex, more populated. Direct divine presence becomes impractical, not because the gods are incapable, but because constant intervention would destabilize rather than preserve order. The flood narratives provide crucial context here. They are not stories of divine anger alone. They are records of what happens when oversight shifts too far toward distance. Humanity multiplies, expands, fills the world with activity. The gods notice, but they do not intervene immediately. Observation precedes action by a long margin. Only when balance becomes untenable does judgment occur. After the flood, something fundamental changes. Lifespans shorten, boundaries harden, access between realms narrows. The texts describe this not as punishment alone, but as recalibration. The world becomes less flexible, more rigid, more predictable. Divine presence does not disappear, but it becomes constrained by new rules. From this point forward, the Anunnaki are rarely active participants. They remain associated with fate and judgment, but they are no longer central characters. Their work is implied rather than narrated. Decisions are made elsewhere. Outcomes unfold without explanation. This is where the idea of watching becomes relevant. The texts do not suggest that oversight ends. They suggest that it becomes indirect. Judgment does not require proximity. Observation does not require visibility. In fact, visibility can interfere with accurate assessment. A watched subject behaves differently when it knows it is being watched. By fading from direct interaction, the Anunnaki's role becomes more effective, not less. Humanity begins acting without expectation of immediate correction. Choices accumulate, patterns emerge, consequences unfold organically rather than being imposed. This interpretation aligns closely with how the Sumerians understood fate. Fate was not random, and it was not arbitrary. It was fixed through accumulation. Actions mattered not because they were morally good or bad, but because they altered balance. When enough imbalance accrued, outcomes followed. The absence of direct divine presence after the earliest periods does not imply that the gods left the system. It implies that the system no longer required constant supervision. Humanity became a self-regulating force for better or worse. What's unsettling about this perspective is how little it depends on belief. It does not require faith in ancient beings or literal divine councils. It simply recognizes a pattern in how authority operates across time. Oversight recedes as autonomy increases, judgment becomes delayed, silence replaces instruction. If the Anunnaki were still watching, nothing would change in daily life. That is the point. Watching is passive until thresholds are crossed. The absence of signs is not evidence of absence, it is evidence of patience. The oldest texts never claim that the gods left. They simply stop narrating their presence in detail. That difference is subtle, but it opens a very different way of understanding the silence that follows. Rather than imagining a world abandoned by its overseers, the texts suggest a world allowed to continue, observed from a distance, measured against standards established long ago, standards that no longer need to be explained because they are already embedded in the structure of reality itself. The story moves forward from here, not toward revelation, but toward implication. The gods do not announce their withdrawal. They allow humanity to forget them, and in doing so, they allow humanity to reveal itself without interference. The idea of withdrawal carries a very different weight than the idea of departure. Departure suggests movement, intention, a clear line crossed from one state into another. Withdrawal is quieter. It happens without ceremony, without announcement, and often without those affected realizing it has occurred at all. When applied to the divine presence described in the oldest Mesopotamian texts, this distinction becomes essential, because nothing in those records supports the idea of the gods leaving the world in any final or absolute sense. What the texts imply instead is something far more restrained and far more enduring. In the earliest periods, divine presence is embedded directly into the mechanics of reality. The gods are not distant overseers, but active participants in the functioning of the world. They regulate water, fertility, boundaries, labour, kingship, and fate. Their authority is immediate and personal, expressed through direct action and direct consequence. Humanity exists within a system where cause and response feel tightly connected to divine will. Over time, that immediacy softens. The gods are still acknowledged, still named, still invoked, but their actions become less visible. Their influence does not disappear, it becomes structural. Instead of intervening directly, they establish frameworks that persist without constant reinforcement. Law replaces decree. Custom replaces command. Ritual replaces conversation. This is not a collapse of belief. It is a shift in how presence operates. The Sumerians did not describe this as abandonment. They described it as order settling into place. Once boundaries are established, they do not need to be redrawn every day. Once systems are functioning, supervision can recede without dissolving authority. In human terms, this is the difference between instruction and habit. At first, guidance must be constant. Over time, behaviour becomes internalized. The authority that once needed to speak now exists implicitly in the way the system operates. The absence of instruction does not mean the absence of rules. The Anunnaki fit into this pattern precisely. They were never portrayed as gods of daily activity. Their domain was not harvests or storms or childbirth. They were associated with judgment, fate, and the underworld, realms that operate beneath the surface of everyday experience. Their influence was never meant to be obvious. Even in the earliest texts, their work happens away from human sight. As divine presence becomes less direct, the Anunnaki do not lose relevance. Their role becomes purer. They're no longer distracted by constant intervention. They observe outcomes rather than actions. They preside over consequence rather than instruction. Withdrawal, in this sense, is not loss of power. It is concentration of function. The gods associated with visible phenomena remain prominent because visibility is their domain. The gods associated with invisible processes fade because invisibility is theirs. This explains why later texts feel quieter without feeling empty. The world continues to operate within a divine framework, but the framework no longer requires explanation. It has become the default state of existence. Humanity does not experience divine absence, it experiences autonomy. This autonomy is not freedom in a modern sense, it is responsibility. Without constant divine correction, human systems begin to reflect human priorities more clearly. Power consolidates, inequality grows, violence becomes organized, expansion accelerates. None of this requires divine encouragement. It unfolds naturally once oversight becomes indirect. The Sumerian worldview did not interpret this as failure. It interpreted it as consequence. The gods established the structure. Humanity filled it with activity. Observation replaced guidance because guidance was no longer effective at scale. This pattern repeats across multiple mythological traditions. Early ages are described as times of closeness between gods and humans. Later ages are characterized by distance, silence, and diminished interaction. This is often read as loss, but within the internal logic of these systems, it represents transition, not collapse. Presence does not require constant manifestation. In fact, constant manifestation undermines authority by making it predictable. Distance preserves influence by making outcomes uncertain. When humans do not know when judgment will occur, behavior becomes more revealing. This is why withdrawal can last indefinitely. There is no endpoint, no final moment when presence fully disappears. Instead, there is a steady reduction of visibility until what remains is structure alone. The Anunnaki, if understood as overseers rather than rulers, would not need to leave to achieve this state. They would simply stop intervening, stop explaining, stop appearing. Their absence would feel like abandonment only to those who expected constant reassurance. The texts never frame divine silence as neglect. Silence is treated as a condition of the world, not a flaw in it. Fate continues to operate. Judgment still occurs. Balance is still restored, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently. The mechanisms are less personal, but no less effective. What fades is not authority, but intimacy. The gods no longer speak directly into human affairs. They allow outcomes to unfold according to established parameters. Humanity becomes responsible for interpreting silence rather than instruction. This shift has profound implications for how presence is understood. A presence that does not announce itself can persist indefinitely. It does not age, it does not decay, it does not require belief to function, it simply watches and records. Withdrawal also removes dependency. When guidance is constant, responsibility is shared. When guidance withdraws, responsibility concentrates. Humanity becomes accountable not to commands, but to consequences. The Sumerian texts reflect this change in tone rather than in content. Later compositions feel more procedural, more formal, less conversational. The gods are still invoked, but they are no longer debated. Their will is assumed to be embedded in the structure of reality itself. This is where the idea of presence fading without ending becomes most relevant. Ending requires resolution. Withdrawal allows continuity. The system persists without visible management. If the Anunnaki were still present in this withdrawn state, their influence would be indistinguishable from natural law. Fate would feel impersonal. Judgment would feel delayed. Silence would feel absolute. And yet, the structure would remain intact. The absence of signs would not indicate abandonment. It would indicate stability. Only when stability fails would presence become visible again. The oldest texts never promise constant oversight. They promise order. How that order is maintained changes over time, but the commitment to balance does not. Withdrawal, in this sense, is not a retreat. It is the final stage of establishment. Once a system can sustain itself, intervention becomes unnecessary. Presence becomes latent rather than active. The Anunnaki do not need temples, prayers, or recognition to fulfill such a role. Watching does not require acknowledgement. Judgment does not require belief. What matters is not whether humanity remembers them, but whether humanity continues to act within the boundaries established long ago. The silence that follows the earliest periods is not an ending. It is the sound of a system running without supervision, still observed, still measured, still subject to consequence, even if no one is listening for footsteps anymore. From here, the story does not move toward disappearance, but toward adaptation. As presence becomes less visible, humanity begins filling the silence with interpretation, myth, and eventually certainty of its own independence. That confidence grows quietly, layer by layer, built on the assumption that no one is watching closely enough to intervene, an assumption that only makes sense if presence has learned how to fade without ever truly leaving. To be seen and to be known are often treated as the same thing, especially in a world shaped by visibility. If something can be observed, recorded, or measured, we assume it is understood. If a presence leaves no obvious trace, we assume it is gone. But the oldest frameworks preserved in Mesopotamian thought draw a sharp, quiet distinction between these two states. Seeing is superficial, knowing is structural, and the difference between them reshapes how presence, oversight and judgment function across long stretches of time. In the earlier Sumerian worldview, visibility was never the primary measure of power. The most influential forces were not always those that appeared directly before human eyes. Water beneath the earth mattered more than rain falling from the sky. Fate mattered more than action. The underworld mattered more than the surface. What shaped outcomes was often hidden, operating beyond immediate perception. The Anunnaki occupy this hidden category. They are not described as beings who demand recognition or constant acknowledgement. Their authority does not rely on spectacle. They are not teachers standing before humanity, nor rulers issuing daily commands. Their domain is deeper, quieter, and more abstract. They are associated with knowing rather than seeing. To be seen implies presence within the field of attention. It means being noticed, reacted to, interpreted. To be known implies integration into the system itself. A known force does not need to appear. Its influence is already accounted for in how the world operates. The Sumerians understood this distinction intuitively. Their gods of visibility governed the sky, the sun, the moon, storms, and fertility. These gods were seen constantly through natural phenomena. Their activity was obvious. Their moods were observable. Their favour or displeasure could be inferred from immediate outcomes. The gods of judgment and fate were different. They did not announce themselves through weather or harvest. They were not associated with predictable cycles. Their involvement was inferred only after events had unfolded. When a ruler fell unexpectedly, when a city declined despite apparent prosperity, when disaster followed long periods of stability, these were not interpreted as accidents. They were understood as the work of forces that had been watching quietly for a long time. Being known in this context does not mean being familiar. It means being accounted for. A force that is known is one whose standards exist independently of observation. It does not need to remind humanity of its presence. It only needs to wait. This reframes the silence that follows the earliest divine narratives. When the texts grow quieter about certain gods, that silence does not imply ignorance. It implies completion. Once standards are set, once roles are defined, once boundaries are established, continuous visibility becomes unnecessary. From a human perspective, this can feel like abandonment. We equate care with attention, authority with presence. But systems that rely on constant attention are fragile. They collapse when supervision falters. Systems that rely on internalized structure endure. The Anunnaki, as judges rather than managers, would have no reason to remain visible. Visibility interferes with honest behavior. A subject that knows it is being watched alters its actions. Observation becomes distorted. Knowing, by contrast, requires distance. It requires allowing patterns to emerge without interference. The Sumerian conception of fate reflects this logic precisely. Fate is not decided moment by moment. It accumulates. Actions layer upon actions. Decisions compound. Outcomes become inevitable, not because they are enforced, but because they are earned through repetition. This is why judgment in these texts often appears delayed. Consequences arrive long after the actions that produced them. From a human perspective, this delay feels unjust or arbitrary. But within the framework of knowing rather than seeing, delay is essential. It allows the system to reveal itself fully. To be seen is to exist in the present moment. To be known is to exist across time. This distinction becomes especially important when considering oversight that extends beyond individual lifespans. Human attention is short. Memory fades, generations forget. A watching presence limited to visibility would lose continuity. A knowing presence does not require memory. It records structurally. The Anunnaki were associated with decrees of fate, not enforcement of behavior. They did not need to observe every action. They needed to understand trajectories, where systems were heading, what patterns were stabilizing, what imbalances were becoming irreversible. From this perspective, the idea of still watching does not imply constant surveillance. It implies continued knowledge, awareness without interference, understanding without engagement. Modern societies often confuse these concepts. Visibility is mistaken for control, surveillance is mistaken for knowledge. But recording activity does not equal understanding outcome. Data without context accumulates endlessly without producing wisdom. The ancient worldview suggests the opposite approach. Less visibility produces clearer knowledge. Distance sharpens perspective. Silence allows systems to speak for themselves. This may explain why the gods associated with judgment recede as civilizations grow more complex. Complexity generates noise. Too much information obscures meaning. Oversight adapts by stepping back. The difference between being seen and being known also reshapes how power operates. A visible authority invites challenge. It becomes a target. It provokes resistance. A hidden authority shapes outcomes without becoming a focal point. This is not manipulation. It is restraint. If the Anunnaki remained present in this restrained way, humanity would not experience their presence as guidance or control. It would experience it as consequence, as the quiet unfolding of outcomes that seem natural, inevitable, and self-generated. This is deeply unsettling because it removes the comfort of blame. If no one is visibly watching, responsibility feels absolute. Failures cannot be attributed to neglect or punishment. Successes cannot be credited to favour. Everything appears to belong to humanity alone. But within the deeper structure, nothing is truly isolated. Patterns are observed, trajectories are noted, balance is measured. The Sumerian text repeatedly emphasized that judgment is not emotional. It is procedural. It is not anger that triggers consequence, but imbalance, noise, excess, overreach, disregard for limits. These are structural problems, not moral failings. To be known by such a system is not to be loved or hated. It is to be understood. This understanding does not require interaction. It does not require belief. It does not even require awareness. A river does not need to know it is being measured for erosion to occur. This distinction also explains why later cultures reinterpret ancient gods as distant, symbolic, or mythic. Visibility fades, so familiarity fades. Knowledge persists, but it is no longer personal. It becomes abstract, embedded, unspoken. What remains is the feeling that something is missing, without clarity about what that something was, a sense of being alone, accompanied by patterns that suggest otherwise. From within such a system, humanity becomes increasingly confident. The absence of visible oversight is interpreted as independence. Progress accelerates, expansion continues, boundaries are tested, often without awareness that they exist. Being unseen encourages risk. Being known ensures consequence. The Anunnaki, if understood as agents of knowing rather than seeing, would not intervene to correct small deviations. They would allow deviation to continue until it revealed its true nature. Only then would balance be restored, often in ways that appear sudden and catastrophic. This aligns with how ancient texts describe resets. Floods, collapses, and endings do not come as responses to single actions. They follow accumulation. They arrive after long periods of tolerance. From the inside, such events feel abrupt. From the outside, they are overdue. The difference between being seen and being known is ultimately the difference between performance and reality. When humans believe they are unseen, they behave authentically. When they believe they're watched, they perform. A system interested in truth would choose knowing over seeing every time. The silence that follows the early ages is therefore not indifference. It is methodological. It is the necessary condition for accurate judgment. This reframes the question of whether ancient overseers are still present. Presence does not require visibility. Knowing does not require interaction. Oversight does not require acknowledgement. The world does not need to feel watched for watching to occur. It only needs to continue revealing itself. As the story moves forward, this distinction becomes increasingly important, because what humanity believes about observation shapes how it behaves, and what it reveals through that behaviour determines what outcomes eventually follow. The line between being seen and being known is thin, quiet, and easy to overlook. But it is along that line that silence becomes meaningful, autonomy becomes revealing, and presence can fade without ever losing its grip on what truly matters. Power does not disappear when its symbols vanish. It changes shape. It sheds what it no longer needs. Thrones, temples, rituals, and visible hierarchies are tools of a particular phase of authority, useful when systems are young, unstable, or dependent on belief for cohesion. But once structures are internalized, once behavior aligns without constant reinforcement, those tools become unnecessary. The oldest texts suggest that divine power followed this same trajectory, moving away from visibility not because it weakened, but because it no longer required reinforcement through presence. In the earliest Sumerian cities, temples were not simply places of worship. They were administrative centers, storehouses, courts, and symbols of order. The gods were present there because society itself was still fragile. Cities depended on irrigation systems that could fail catastrophically. Food supplies were vulnerable. Law was still being standardized. Authority needed a visible anchor to hold everything together. Temples served that function. They were not built for the gods' comfort. They were built to stabilize human systems. The gods associated with these temples were the ones tied to daily survival: fertility, rain, storms, sun, and moon. These were forces people could see, feel, and fear immediately. Their gods needed faces, names, rituals, and constant acknowledgement because their domains were visible and volatile. Presence reassured people that the system was functioning. The Anunnaki did not occupy this role. They were not patrons of crops or protectors of cities. They were not gods who demanded offerings to ensure tomorrow's harvest. Their authority was not transactional. It did not operate on a daily exchange of worship for favour. They presided over judgment, fate, and long-term balance, realms that do not benefit from constant visibility. As societies grew more complex, the need for visible divine management decreased. Human institutions took over many functions that had once required direct divine attribution. Laws were written down, bureaucracies formed, armies enforced borders, markets regulated distribution. These developments did not remove divine authority from the system, they absorbed it. What had once been enforced through ritual became enforced through structure. The divine order did not retreat. It embedded itself into human systems so thoroughly that its origin no longer needed to be remembered. This is where thrones lose relevance. A throne is a symbol of presence. It marks where authority resides. But once authority becomes systemic, it no longer needs a location. It operates everywhere and nowhere at once. The most stable forms of power are diffuse. They do not announce themselves. They shape outcomes rather than issue commands. The Anunnaki, as watchers rather than rulers, would have little use for temples once this transition occurred. Temples attract attention. They invite negotiation. They create expectations of response. A watcher interested in observing genuine behaviour would avoid such focal points. In this sense, the decline of temple-centred authority is not evidence of divine withdrawal. It is evidence of maturation. Humanity no longer needs visible reminders of oversight to function. The system can be observed without interference. This pattern is not unique to ancient religion. Human power structures follow it repeatedly. Early governments rely on spectacle. Kings wear crowns. Palaces dominate skylines. Authority is made visible because it is fragile. Over time, power shifts into institutions, norms, and systems that no longer require display. The most powerful forces in modern life rarely occupy thrones. They operate quietly, through regulation, infrastructure, and expectation. The Sumerians did not conceptualize power in modern terms, but they understood its evolution intuitively. Their texts reflect a gradual movement away from visible divine rule toward embedded order. The gods do not vanish. Their influence becomes harder to separate from the world itself. This is why later texts feel procedural rather than dramatic. Divine decisions are no longer narrated as conversations or conflicts. They are reflected in outcomes. A city falls, a dynasty ends, a flood comes. The reason is rarely explained in detail. Explanation is unnecessary once the framework is established. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld reinforces this interpretation. The underworld is not a place of spectacle. It is a place of inevitability. Everyone arrives there eventually. It does not need advertisement. Its authority is absolute precisely because it is unseen. Judgment that operates through inevitability does not require temples. It does not require worship. It does not even require awareness. It functions regardless of belief. As temple-based worship declined or transformed, the gods most dependent on ritual visibility faded into symbolism. But the gods associated with fate and consequence did not disappear. They simply stopped being represented. This absence of representation is often mistaken for irrelevance. In reality, it suggests permanence. Symbols change, structures endure. The Anunnaki, if still present in this way, would not seek recognition. Recognition distorts observation. It invites performance. It creates incentives to appease rather than to reveal. A watcher interested in understanding the true nature of a system would avoid becoming its centre. They would allow the system to believe it operates independently. This belief in independence is crucial. It reveals priorities. It exposes values. It shows how power is used when no higher authority is perceived to be watching closely. Throughout history, periods of rapid expansion and exploitation often coincide with declining belief in oversight. When people believe no one is watching, limits erode. Resources are exhausted, inequality intensifies. Short-term gain overrides long-term balance. The ancient texts do not moralize this behavior. They record its consequences. Overreach leads to collapse. Excess leads to correction. Not immediately, but eventually. This delayed response is consistent with oversight that does not sit on a throne. A seated ruler reacts quickly to challenges. A watcher reacts only when thresholds are crossed. The idea of watchers without thrones also explains why divine presence becomes harder to locate as societies advance. Complexity creates noise. The more active a system becomes, the harder it is to see what guides it. Oversight adapts by withdrawing from visibility. The gods most visible in later traditions are often those reshaped by human need. They become metaphors, moral guides, or cultural symbols. The gods least visible are those whose function does not change with human preference. The Anunnaki belong to the latter category. Their role does not depend on how humans imagine them. It depends on how systems behave. If they still watch, they do so without temples, without rituals, without acknowledgement. Their power does not reside in belief. It resides in consequence. This makes them uniquely unsettling. A god who demands worship can be appeased. A god who governs plug-in is indifferent to recognition cannot be negotiated with. The absence of temples also removes a channel for complaint. Early gods were argued with, petitioned, bargained with. Watchers do not engage in dialogue. They do not respond to prayer. They respond to patterns. This is a colder form of oversight, but also a more consistent one. It does not favour individuals. It does not reward devotion. It maintains balance at scale. From within such a system, humanity experiences freedom. It acts, builds, destroys, and innovates without visible restraint. But that freedom is conditional. It persists only as long as balance holds. The Sumerian worldview accepts this without protest. The gods are not portrayed as benevolent caretakers. They are portrayed as administrators of order. Their concern is not human happiness, but systemic stability. This perspective reframes the question of disappearance. Power that no longer needs temples has not gone anywhere. It has simply become indistinguishable from the world it governs. When divine authority no longer requires a place, it cannot be destroyed by destroying its symbols. Temples can burn, statues can fall, rituals can fade. The underlying structure remains untouched. This is why later cultures can forget the Anunnaki without invalidating their role. Forgetting does not dismantle systems. It only removes awareness of their origins. The Watchers do not lose power when they lose names. They lose only narrative presence. In a world where authority no longer announces itself, the absence of temples is not evidence of abandonment. It is evidence of confidence. A system that no longer needs reinforcement trusts its structure. The Anunnaki, understood as such a system of oversight, would not return to thrones. Thrones belong to beginnings, not to continuities. They mark authority that still needs to be seen. What remains is quieter, harder to locate, and far more enduring. A form of power that operates without display, without recognition, and without interruption. As humanity moves forward believing it has outgrown oversight, the Watchers remain relevant precisely because they no longer compete with human authority. They do not rule, they allow. And allowance, over long stretches of time, reveals far more about a system than command ever could. From here, the focus shifts again, away from visible power and toward the implications of silence itself, toward how absence reshapes memory, myth, and the slow erosion of awareness that something older and quieter may still be paying attention without ever needing a place to sit. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, absence, or indifference. In human terms, silence feels like disengagement. When authority does not speak, we assume it has relinquished control. When guidance is not offered, we interpret that gap as permission or neglect. But in systems that operate across long spans of time, silence is rarely empty. It is deliberate. It is strategic. And in many cases, it is the most effective form of control available. The oldest Mesopotamian texts do not describe divine silence as confusion or loss. They treat it as a condition that emerges once order has been established. After creation, after structure, after boundaries, the gods do not continue narrating every outcome. They stop explaining. They stop intervening publicly. The world is allowed to function within parameters that no longer need reinforcement through constant instruction. This is unsettling to modern minds, because we associate care with communication. We expect authority to justify itself, to clarify intentions, to respond to mistakes in real time. Silence feels irresponsible. But the Sumerian worldview does not frame oversight as emotional involvement. It frames it as maintenance of balance, and balance does not require constant speech. Silence works precisely because it forces systems to reveal themselves. When instructions are given continuously, behaviour adapts to the instruction rather than to underlying values. When authority speaks often, subjects learn how to perform compliance. They learn what to say, how to appear, how to signal alignment without changing structure. Silence removes that layer. It eliminates performance. In the absence of instruction, actions become honest. Priorities become visible. Choices are made without expectation of immediate correction. Over time, patterns emerge that could never be observed in a system constantly nudged toward acceptable behaviour. This is why silence can exert control without exerting force. It does not direct action. It allows action. and allowance over time produces consequences far more revealing than obedience ever could. The Anunnaki, as figures associated with judgment rather than governance, would not benefit from constant communication. Their function was not to guide humanity step by step, but to assess trajectories. They were concerned with where systems were heading, not with how individuals behaved moment to moment. Silence creates distance. Distance allows perspective. Perspective allows evaluation. In human institutions, this principle is quietly understood. Oversight bodies do not interfere in daily operations unless thresholds are crossed. Audits are not constant. Reviews are periodic. Silence does not mean absence. It means monitoring without interference. Ancient texts reflect this logic. After early periods of direct divine involvement, the gods become harder to locate. They do not disappear, they stop responding. Prayers continue, rituals continue, but answers become ambiguous, delayed, or symbolic. Silence replaces dialogue. This shift changes human behavior profoundly. When answers stop arriving, people fill the gap themselves. Interpretation replaces instruction. Authority migrates inward. Societies begin deciding for themselves what is acceptable, what is necessary, what is justified. From an oversight perspective, this is ideal. The system begins generating its own data. Actions are no longer constrained by fear of immediate divine response. They are shaped by human priorities alone. Silence also extends time. A spoken command creates an immediate horizon. Silence stretches expectation indefinitely. When no response arrives, subjects either grow reckless or cautious. Both reactions are informative. In the Sumerian worldview, fate is not reactive. It accumulates. Silence allows accumulation to proceed uninterrupted. The longer the silence, the clearer the eventual outcome. This is why judgment in these texts often feels sudden. Long periods of apparent inaction precede decisive events. From within the system, these events feel abrupt and unjustified. From outside the system, they are overdue. Silence also prevents negotiation. A speaking authority can be bargained with, appealed to, persuaded. Silence closes those channels. There is nothing to argue with, no response to provoke, no reassurance to extract. This transforms power from relational to structural. It is no longer about favour or disfavour. It is about alignment or misalignment. Systems that align persist. Systems that do not eventually fail. The Anunnaki, understood as arbiters of fate, would have no interest in maintaining relationships. Relationship implies bias. Judgment requires distance. Silence ensures impartiality. It removes emotional entanglement. It allows outcomes to unfold without interference. This does not mean silence is neutral. It is selective. Silence is maintained only while balance holds within tolerable limits. When thresholds are crossed, silence ends decisively. The flood narratives illustrate this perfectly. The gods do not warn humanity collectively. They do not issue public ultimatums. They do not attempt reform through dialogue. Silence prevails until the decision is final. This is not cruelty in the Sumerian framework. It is procedural. Once silence breaks, the outcome cannot be negotiated. Silence preserves flexibility. Speech ends it. Silence also reshapes belief. Over time, unanswered prayers lead to reinterpretation. Gods become symbolic. Myths become stories. Presence becomes metaphor. Humanity gradually convinces itself that oversight has ended. From the perspective of control, this belief is powerful. A system that believes it is unobserved behaves differently than one that believes it is watched. It reveals its true priorities. Silence allows humanity to forget boundaries without erasing them. Limits remain in place, but awareness fades. When those limits are finally encountered, the collision feels catastrophic. This is not punishment. It is consequence meet in ignorance. Silence also prevents dependency. Constant guidance creates reliance. Silence forces adaptation. Societies learn to solve problems internally. They innovate, exploit, expand, and experiment. From a human-centered perspective, this feels like progress. From a systemic perspective, it is data. The Sumerian texts do not condemn humanity for taking advantage of silence. They record what happens next. Overextension leads to collapse. Noise leads to correction. Excess leads to reset. Silence does not stop these processes. It allows them to mature. This is why silence is a form of control rather than abandonment. It sets the conditions under which systems operate. It determines when intervention becomes necessary, by allowing imbalance to become undeniable. In a system governed through silence, the responsibility shifts entirely onto the subject. There is no guidance to blame, no command to disobey. Outcomes belong to the system itself. This removes ambiguity. When correction arrives, it is not arbitrary. It is traceable, even if humans refuse to trace it. The Anunnaki, if still present in this way, would not speak because speaking would undermine their function. Their silence would not be passive. It would be the mechanism itself. Silence also protects continuity. Spoken authority ages. Words change meaning. Decrees become outdated. Silence does not decay. It remains constant across generations. A system built on silence can operate indefinitely. It does not require renewal. It does not require reinterpretation. It does not require belief. This may be why the Anunnaki fade from narrative prominence without fading from relevance. Their work does not depend on being remembered. It depends on being effective. Human memory is short. Civilizations forget their origins quickly. Silence accelerates this forgetting. But forgetting does not dismantle structure. It only removes awareness of it. The most enduring forms of control are those that no longer need to assert themselves. They shape behavior through consequence rather than instruction. In this light, divine silence becomes less mysterious and more functional. It is not an unanswered question. It is an answer that operates too slowly for immediate recognition. Silence also allows multiplicity. Different cultures interpret absence differently. Some create new gods, some turn inward, some reject oversight entirely. From an observational standpoint, this diversity is valuable. It reveals how systems behave under identical conditions of uncertainty. If oversight spoke constantly, behavior would converge. Silence allows divergence. The Anunnaki's silence, therefore, would not be neglect. It would be method. A way of allowing humanity to define itself without interference. The longer the silence lasts, the more confident humanity becomes. Confidence leads to acceleration. Acceleration leads to strain. At some point, silence is no longer sufficient. That point is not announced, it is reached. Until then, silence remains the most efficient form of control. It costs nothing. It reveals everything. As the story continues, the consequences of prolonged silence begin to take shape, not as immediate disasters, but as subtle shifts in memory, myth, and self-understanding. As humanity gradually forgets what it once assumed, and begins to believe that the quiet means no one is paying attention at all. Memory does not disappear all at once. It thins, it stretches, it loses edges before it loses content. What begins as lived experience becomes recollection. Recollection becomes story. Story becomes symbol, and symbol, over time, becomes myth. This process does not require deliberate deception, censorship, or catastrophe. It happens naturally when direct contact fades, and explanation is no longer reinforced by experience. The Sumerian texts preserve this process in slow motion. They do not record a single moment when the gods withdrew from the world. Instead, they show how closeness gives way to distance, how familiarity gives way to reverence, and how reverence eventually gives way to abstraction. The erasure is not violent. It is gentle. It is administrative. It happens because there is no longer anything new to say. In the earliest layers, divine presence is practical. Gods are involved in irrigation, law, labour, disease, fertility, and survival. Their decisions have immediate consequences. Their displeasure is tangible. Their favour is visible. People do not need theology to explain them because experience does that work. As intervention becomes rarer, explanation begins to replace experience. When people no longer see gods act directly, they begin to remember how gods used to act. Memory becomes important precisely when presence fades. Stories emerge not to invent gods, but to preserve the logic of a world that once felt closer. This is where myth begins, not as fiction, but as preservation. Myth is what remains when direct contact is no longer available to confirm or deny what was once assumed. It is not designed to deceive, it is designed to retain coherence. The Anunnaki are transformed through this process more than most divine figures. Because their role was never highly visible to begin with, they were especially vulnerable to being absorbed into abstraction. They did not preside over obvious phenomena like the sun or storms. They did not leave daily reminders of their function. Their authority operated quietly, beneath the surface, tied to fate, judgment, and long-term consequence. When direct interaction faded, there was little to anchor them in lived experience. Their names remained, but their actions became harder to point to. Over generations, they were remembered less as active participants, and more as conceptual forces, judges rather than agents, principles rather than presences. This is the soft erasure the texts imply. Not removal, but dilution. Not denial, but reinterpretation. Myth does not erase gods. It repackages them in forms that survive cultural change. As societies evolve, stories adapt to remain relevant. Concrete details fade. Symbolic meaning expands. The gods become less specific and more universal. This process accelerates when societies grow larger and more complex. In small communities, memory is personal. Stories are corrected by elders who remember differently. In large civilizations, memory becomes institutional. Stories are written, standardized, and ritualized. Flexibility decreases. Ambiguity increases. At this stage, myth becomes authoritative, not because it is accurate, but because it is stable. It stops changing. It stops responding to experience. It becomes a container rather than a record. The Anunnaki's transformation into myth follows this pattern precisely. Early texts treat them as part of an active system. Later texts treat them as part of a cosmic order that no longer requires explanation. Eventually they become names associated with underworld judgment, invoked but not described. This does not mean belief weakens. It means contact has ended. Direct contact is the most fragile form of authority. It depends on continuity. Once broken, it cannot be restored through memory alone. Memory can preserve form, but not function. This is why myth feels distant even when it's detailed. It describes a world that no longer behaves the way the story says it should. Gods no longer answer prayers directly. Omens become ambiguous. Outcomes feel delayed. People respond to this gap in different ways. Some intensify ritual, hoping to provoke response. Some reinterpret gods as moral ideals rather than active forces. Some reject divine involvement altogether. All of these responses appear across Mesopotamian history. What remains consistent is the silence. Silence accelerates myth-making because it demands explanation. When presence does not correct interpretation, interpretation multiplies. Over time, stories drift further from their original function. This drift is not accidental. It is enabled by the withdrawal described earlier. When oversight no longer speaks, memory becomes unregulated. Stories adapt to human needs rather than reflecting external constraint. The soft erasure of direct contact is therefore not the loss of gods, but the loss of reference. Without direct interaction, there is no way to test which memories still align with reality. myth becomes self-referential. This explains why later cultures reinterpret ancient gods in radically different ways. The same names persist, but their meanings shift. Attributes change. Relationships rearrange. The gods become reflections of the societies that remember them. The Anunnaki are particularly affected because their original role was not emotionally engaging. They were not protectors or lovers or warriors. They were administrators of fate. That function does not translate well into storytelling without active demonstration. As a result, later traditions often misunderstand them. Some reduce them to demons. Others inflate them into creators. Still others erase them entirely. All of these interpretations are attempts to make sense of names detached from experience. The Sumerian texts themselves hint at this detachment. Later compositions speak of ancient times as fundamentally different. Lifespans were longer, boundaries were softer, contact was closer. The world felt less opaque. This sense of loss is subtle but persistent. It does not manifest as grief. It manifests as nostalgia, as the idea that something essential has slipped away, replaced by procedure and distance. Memory tries to bridge this gap. Myth tries to preserve coherence. But neither can restore function. This is why the erasure is soft rather than absolute. Gods do not disappear. They become unreachable. Their influence is felt only through outcomes, not interaction. From the perspective of oversight, this is ideal. Memory degrades, myth transforms, direct contact ends. But the system continues to operate. Humanity forgets how the system was established, but not that it exists. For watchers, this forgetfulness is useful. It removes bias. It removes expectation. It allows observation without distortion. A system that knows it is being judged behaves differently than one that believes judgment is mythological. The latter reveals its true priorities. The Anunnaki, if still watching, would not correct the drift of myth. They would allow it. Correction would reintroduce contact. Contact would interfere with observation. This suggests that myth is not a failure of memory but a stage of distancing, a necessary buffer between presence and autonomy. As myth grows, direct contact recedes further into the past. Eventually it becomes indistinguishable from fiction. At that point, belief loses its regulatory function. Behavior is no longer shaped by expectation of oversight. This is when systems begin operating at full autonomy. The Sumerian worldview does not frame this as rebellion. It frames it as consequence. Humanity grows louder, more confident, more expansive. Without direct contact, limits are tested unconsciously. Memory fades not because people choose to forget, but because forgetting is efficient. It reduces cognitive load. It allows focus on immediate concerns. Myth survives because it is adaptable. It can be reshaped to justify new structures of power. It can be moralized, allegorized, or dismissed. But beneath myth, the structure remains. Fate still unfolds. Consequences still arrive. The soft erasure of direct contact does not dismantle oversight. It disguises it. This disguise allows history to proceed without interruption. Civilizations rise and fall believing they are alone. Patterns repeat. Excess accumulates. Collapse occurs. From within the system, these events feel tragic and inexplicable. From outside, they are predictable. Memory and myth obscure this perspective. They focus attention backward rather than outward. They encourage interpretation rather than observation. Silence completes the process. Without correction, memory becomes myth. Without contact, myth becomes story. Without story, names fade. What remains is a world that believes it has outgrown oversight, unaware that oversight no longer requires belief to function. The Anunnaki, remembered vaguely, misinterpreted frequently, and dismissed easily, become irrelevant to daily thought. And that irrelevance is precisely what allows their original function to persist without interference. As the narrative continues, the consequences of this erasure begin to surface more clearly, not through sudden revelation, but through patterns that repeat across cultures and eras, suggesting that even when memory fades and myth distorts, something consistent continues to measure, record, and wait. And there is a point in every system where instruction stops being effective. Rules can guide behaviour only while they are enforced, explained, and remembered. Once a system grows beyond a certain scale, rule becomes noise. It creates compliance without understanding, obedience without alignment. At that stage, authority must change its method, or lose its ability to assess what the system has actually become. The oldest Mesopotamian texts hint at precisely such a shift. Not a collapse of divine authority, but a refinement of it. Rule gives way to observation. In the earliest periods, divine behaviour is overt. Gods issue commands, assign roles, correct imbalance directly. Humanity exists within a framework where guidance is frequent and consequence is immediate. This makes sense in a newly ordered world. Boundaries are still forming. Expectations are unclear. Intervention stabilizes the system. But as time unfolds, the texts grow quieter about instruction. Gods are no longer shown correcting every deviation. They stop narrating their decisions. They stop justifying outcomes. The world is allowed to proceed without commentary. This is often interpreted as withdrawal, but the pattern suggests something else. Authority has not vanished. It has changed posture. Instead of directing behaviour, it begins to measure it. Observation replaces rule not because rule failed, but because rule succeeded. Once a system internalizes structure, further instruction only distorts behaviour. Observation, by contrast, reveals whether the structure holds under pressure. The Anunnaki's role aligns perfectly with this transition. They were never rule-makers in the day-to-day sense. They were arbiters of fate, associated with judgment after outcomes had already unfolded. Their domain was not obedience, but consequence. When rule dominates, behaviour becomes performative. Subjects learn how to appear compliant. They adapt to enforcement rather than to principle. This creates stability on the surface while hiding deeper imbalances. Observation strips away that performance. Without visible rules being reinforced, systems operate according to their internal priorities. Power consolidates where it is valued. Resources flow where incentive directs them. Expansion follows perceived opportunity rather than prescribed limit. From an oversight perspective, this phase is critical. It reveals what the system truly is, not what it claims to be. The Sumerian worldview did not frame this shift as abandonment. It treated it as maturation. Humanity was no longer a fragile construct requiring constant correction. It had become a self-directed force, capable of reshaping its environment at scale. At that point, divine behaviour adapts. Speaking less reveals more. Intervening less clarifies responsibility. Allowing autonomy exposes intention. This does not mean the gods become passive. Observation is active in a different way. It requires patience, record, and restraint. It resists the impulse to correct prematurely. In human terms, this is the difference between teaching a child and evaluating an adult. Instruction dominates early. Observation dominates later. Guidance recedes not because interest fades, but because assessment requires distance. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld reinforces this logic. The underworld is not a place of guidance. It is a place of accounting. It does not shape behaviour. It reflects outcome. Judgment occurs after life has been lived, not while it is being negotiated. This perspective reframes the apparent silence of divine authority. Silence is not inaction. It is a refusal to interfere. Interference alters data. It changes trajectories. It introduces bias. Observation allows systems to unfold naturally, revealing whether they are stable or self-destructive. The text suggests that once humanity reached a certain threshold of autonomy, direct rule became counterproductive. It would have prevented the very behaviours that needed to be observed. This explains the long gaps between divine interventions described in myth. Floods, collapses, and resets are not frequent. They occur after extended periods of silence. The silence is not oversight failing, it is oversight working. When intervention finally occurs, it appears sudden only because observation has been invisible. From within the system, it feels abrupt. From outside, it is overdue. The shift from rule to observation also transforms how authority is perceived. Under rule, authority feels personal. Gods argue, negotiate, and intervene. Under observation, authority feels impersonal. Outcomes occur without explanation. This impersonal quality often leads later cultures to reinterpret divine behaviour as cruelty or indifference. But within the original framework, it is procedural. Judgment is not emotional, it is structural. This is why later texts emphasize fate rather than command. Fate does not instruct, it resolves. Observation allows fate to form. The Anunnaki in this role do not need to guide humanity, they need to understand it. Guidance would compromise that understanding. This is deeply uncomfortable for human-centered narratives, which prefer benevolent oversight. But the Sumerian worldview does not centre human comfort. It centres balance. Balance cannot be maintained through constant correction. It must be tested. As societies expand, innovate and exploit, observation becomes more valuable than instruction. It reveals whether growth is sustainable or terminal. The silence that accompanies this shift is therefore intentional. It removes external justification. Humans cannot claim they were told to act a certain way. Responsibility consolidates. This consolidation is visible in how later civilizations justify their actions. Kings rule by law rather than divine command. Empires expand through strategy rather than prophecy. Morality becomes codified rather than revealed. All of this occurs within a world that still assumes divine order, but no longer expects divine guidance. This assumption creates confidence. Confidence leads to acceleration. Acceleration reveals limits. Observation tracks this process patiently. The Anunnaki, if still present, would not interrupt it. They would allow systems to reach their natural conclusions. This does not mean catastrophe is inevitable. It means outcome reflects structure. Stable systems persist. Unstable systems collapse. The Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize that divine judgment is not arbitrary. It follows imbalance. Noise, excess, and disregard for limit precede correction. Under observation, these signals become clearer. Without constant rule, systems cannot hide behind obedience. This shift also explains why divine behavior becomes harder to interpret. Without rules being issued, humans must infer standards from outcomes. Interpretation multiplies. Certainty diminishes. Myth fills the gap left by instruction. Philosophy replaces prophecy. Law replaces commandment. From an oversight perspective, this is acceptable. Understanding does not require agreement. It requires clarity. Observation also allows comparison. Different cultures respond differently to silence. Some become cautious. Others become aggressive. Some prioritize balance. Others prioritize expansion. These variations reveal structural tendencies that would remain hidden under uniform rule. The Anunnaki's silence, therefore, creates diversity. Diversity creates data. This is not benevolence or malice. It is evaluation. The shift from rule to observation marks a fundamental change in divine behavior, not in intention. The goal remains order. The method changes. Once order is established, maintaining it requires knowing when to act, not acting constantly. This is why divine intervention in later myths feels catastrophic rather than corrective. It is no longer about guidance, it is about reset. Reset occurs only when observation confirms that correction within the system is no longer possible. The long silence before such moments is not neglect, it is confirmation. Humanity often interprets this silence as permission. That interpretation accelerates behavior. Boundaries are tested not because they are known, but because they are forgotten. For observers, forgetting is informative. It shows which limits were internalized and which were imposed. The Anunnaki's role as watchers would depend on this forgetting. Awareness of observation distorts behavior. Forgetting restores authenticity. This authenticity is what makes judgment meaningful. As observation replaces rule, the world becomes louder, faster, and more complex. Authority becomes invisible. Responsibility becomes absolute. The texts do not describe this as progress or decline. They describe it as transition. A system once guided must eventually be assessed. The silence that accompanies this assessment is not emptiness. It is attention. And attention, when combined with patience and distance, reshapes power into something that no longer needs to speak to remain in control. From here, the implications of a watched but unguided world begin to surface more clearly, not through divine statements, but through the way humanity adapts to freedom, misinterprets silence, and slowly convinces itself that observation has ended, even as it continues to define what outcomes will eventually follow. After intervention fades, the world does not become empty. It becomes quieter in a very specific way. The structures remain, the boundaries still exist. The mechanisms that govern consequence continue to operate. What changes is the feeling of proximity. Humanity moves forward without the sense of immediate oversight, without the expectation that guidance will arrive at the moment of uncertainty. From within that experience, it feels like independence. From outside it, it looks more like exposure. The oldest texts never describe a world abandoned by divine systems. They describe a world released from direct supervision. That difference is subtle, but decisive. A system that has been abandoned collapses quickly. A system that has been released continues to function, sometimes more efficiently than before, because it no longer relies on external correction to maintain order. In the periods that follow major divine interventions in Mesopotamian tradition, particularly after the flood narratives, humanity does not descend into chaos. It rebuilds, cities rise again, agriculture resumes, trade networks expand, writing becomes more sophisticated, law is codified, kingship stabilizes. All of this happens without renewed divine instruction. This continuity matters. It suggests that intervention was never meant to be permanent governance. It was corrective, not supervisory. Once balance was restored, humanity was expected to operate within the restored framework on its own. The texts reflect this expectation clearly. After intervention, gods rarely explain themselves. They do not justify the new order. They do not provide ongoing reassurance. They allow humans to interpret the world as they see fit. This is where the feeling of being alone emerges, not because oversight has ended, but because interaction has. Humanity begins to experience cause and effect without commentary. Success feels earned. Failure feels unfair. The connection between action and outcome stretches across longer spans of time, often beyond a single lifetime. This stretching produces uncertainty. Without immediate divine response, it becomes harder to tell whether actions matter. Patterns take longer to reveal themselves. Feedback slows. From a human perspective, this feels like abandonment. From a systemic perspective, it is autonomy. Autonomy, however, is not isolation. The framework within which humanity operates still reflects older parameters. Resources are finite. Growth produces strain. Excess creates imbalance. These principles do not disappear when God stops speaking. What changes is awareness. Without guidance, humanity begins constructing its own explanations. Philosophies emerge. Moral systems form. Legal codes evolve. Each culture interprets the silence differently, filling it with meaning that reflects local priorities rather than universal structure. Some societies become cautious, emphasizing balance and continuity. Others become expansionist, interpreting silence as permission. Some seek new gods. Others deny the old ones entirely. From the perspective of observation, This divergence is revealing. It shows how different systems behave under identical conditions of uncertainty. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment rather than instruction, would not correct these interpretations. Correction would interfere with observation. Allowing misinterpretation reveals intention. This is the unsettling aspect of being on one's own but not alone. Humanity believes it has outgrown oversight. It acts accordingly. Meanwhile, the structures that record consequence continue operating silently. In such a world, responsibility becomes absolute. There is no divine authority to blame for misjudgment, no instruction to misinterpret. Outcomes belong entirely to human decisions. This concentration of responsibility accelerates development. Innovation increases, power consolidates, inequality deepens. Environmental transformation accelerates. None of this contradicts divine order. It unfolds within it. The silence after intervention is not a void. It is a testing ground. This is why the Sumerian worldview does not romanticize the post-intervention world. It does not describe it as a golden age. It describes it as constrained, limited, and fragile. Lifespans shorten. Access between realms narrows. Certainty diminishes. Humanity becomes smaller in cosmic terms, even as it grows more complex socially. This contraction is not punishment. It is containment, a way of ensuring that autonomy does not escalate into uncontrollable imbalance too quickly. From within this world, humanity begins measuring itself against itself. Progress becomes self-referential. Achievement is defined internally rather than relationally. This creates confidence. Confidence fuels expansion. Expansion reveals limits. The absence of further intervention reinforces the belief that no one is watching closely enough to care. That belief shapes behavior profoundly. It encourages risk. It normalizes excess. It reframes restraint as unnecessary. The texts never suggest that this belief is accurate. They suggest it is consequential. Being alone but not alone means that observation continues without reassurance. Humanity is free to act, but not free from outcome. This distinction becomes clearer over long spans of time. Civilizations rise believing they are exceptional. They fall believing the collapse was unforeseeable. Patterns repeat across regions and eras. From inside history, these collapses appear unique. From outside history, they follow recognizable trajectories. The Sumerian worldview accepts this repetition. It does not seek to prevent it through constant intervention. It allows it to demonstrate structural truths. Intervention interrupts learning. Silence enables it. This is why post-intervention humanity is not guided back toward balance gently. Balance is encountered through consequence. The Anunnaki, if still watching, would not view this as cruelty. It would be procedure. Systems that cannot maintain balance without instruction reveal their instability. Systems that can adapt persist. The silence following intervention also removes hope of rescue. Without expectation of divine correction, humans must confront limits directly. Resource exhaustion is no longer framed as divine displeasure. It is framed as logistical failure. This reframing makes collapse feel secular rather than sacred. That perception increases shock when it occurs. But from a longer view, collapse is simply adjustment. The world after intervention becomes a place where meaning is generated internally. Culture, identity, and purpose are human constructions rather than divine assignments. This gives humanity unprecedented creative power. It also removes external checks on ambition. The Anunnaki's absence from daily life would allow this process to unfold without interference. Their role as observers would remain intact precisely because humanity no longer expects them to act. Being on one's own but not alone creates a paradox. Humanity feels free while remaining constrained. It feels autonomous while remaining measured. This paradox drives much of human history. It fuels exploration and conquest. It produces innovation and destruction in equal measure. The silence that makes autonomy possible also ensures that consequences cannot be externalized. There is no one to argue with when limits are reached. The Sumerian texts do not resolve this tension. They record it. They show a world that continues after God stops speaking. A world that grows louder, faster, and more confident. A world that mistakes silence for absence. Within that mistake, patterns form that eventually demand correction. The story does not move toward reassurance. It moves toward implication. Humanity adapts to a world where guidance is gone but structure remains, learning to live as if alone, while never truly escaping the systems that continue to observe what it does with that freedom. As the narrative continues, attention shifts from the aftermath of intervention to the subtler signals that emerge in a world convinced of its independence, signals that were never meant to announce oversight, but to quietly record how autonomy reshapes behavior when silence is mistaken for solitude. If oversight continued after direct intervention faded, then any signs of that oversight would not announce themselves clearly. They could not. Obvious signals invite interpretation, reaction, and performance. They create feedback loops that distort behavior. A system that wishes to understand how something functions when left alone cannot mark its presence loudly without contaminating the results. What remains instead are traces that only register in hindsight, patterns that are visible only when viewed across time rather than moments, signals that were never designed to be noticed as signals at all. The oldest texts never suggest that signs would arrive as warnings. They do not describe divine markers placed deliberately to be recognized and decoded. They describe outcomes, limits, and thresholds that exist whether or not they are understood. In that framework, a sign is not a message. It is a consequence that reveals structure after the fact. Human expectation works in the opposite direction. We look for clarity. We expect oversight, if it exists, to communicate in ways that feel intentional and legible. We imagine signs as interruptions, as events that stand out from ordinary life. But systems that rely on subtle observation would avoid disruption precisely because disruption changes behavior. This is why the most persistent signals in human history do not appear as singular events. They appear as repetition. Civilizations rise rapidly, expand beyond sustainable limits, centralize power, strain resources, and collapse. The details differ. The pattern does not. From within each civilization, the collapse feels accidental, unjust, or unprecedented. From a wider perspective, it follows a familiar arc. These repetitions are not messages directed at individuals. They are reflections of structural imbalance. They do not say, "Stop doing this." They show what happens when it continues. The Sumerian worldview did not treat these patterns as warnings. It treated them as confirmations. When balance is violated, correction follows. The timing is variable, the form is unpredictable, the outcome is consistent. If the Anunnaki were still watching, their signs would not be symbolic gestures or coded communications. They would be embedded in how systems behave under pressure. They would appear as constraints encountered repeatedly by societies that believe they are unique. Environmental limits are one such constraint. Across history, societies that assume resources are effectively infinite behave differently from those that recognize scarcity. When abundance appears stable, expansion accelerates, extraction increases, restraint diminishes. The resulting strain often emerges long after the initial decisions that caused it. From within the system, this strain feels like misfortune. From outside it, it looks like delayed consequence. Population growth follows a similar pattern. When early societies stabilize food production and security, populations grow rapidly. Infrastructure lags, governance strains, inequality widens, social cohesion erodes. These outcomes are not random. They are predictable results of unchecked expansion. None of these developments announce themselves as signs. They feel normal while they unfold. Only later are they interpreted as mistakes. Technological acceleration also produces signals that are difficult to recognize in real time. Innovation increases capability faster than ethical frameworks can adapt. Power concentrates in tools rather than institutions. The ability to act outpaces the ability to foresee consequence. From within the moment, this feels like progress. From a longer view, it introduces instability. The oldest texts never suggest that oversight intervenes at the moment of innovation. Intervention occurs only when accumulated imbalance threatens systemic collapse. Until then, observation continues. This creates a gap between action and response that humans often misinterpret. The absence of immediate correction is taken as validation. Success is assumed to confirm wisdom. Expansion is assumed to confirm rightness. The signs, when they arrive, do not arrive as messages. They arrive as limits that cannot be negotiated. Climate shifts, resource depletion, demographic pressure, internal fragmentation, and external conflict often converge rather than occur in isolation. These convergences are not accidental. They reflect systems pushed beyond their capacity to adapt incrementally. From within a civilization, such convergence feels like a cascade of unrelated crises. From outside, it is a single process reaching saturation. If oversight were still present, these convergences would be the only signals required. They do not instruct. They resolve. The idea that signs should be obvious assumes that oversight is concerned with persuasion. The Sumerian framework suggests otherwise. Oversight is concerned with balance. Balance does not require comprehension to be enforced. This is why so many cultures record similar stories without sharing direct contact. Floods, fires, collapses, and resets appear across mythologies worldwide. These are not warnings about specific actions. They are records of what happens when systems exceed tolerable thresholds. The fact that these stories are remembered as myth rather than instruction reinforces the subtlety of the signs. They are not preserved as manuals, they are preserved as memories of consequence. Modern observers often search for hidden messages in ancient texts, looking for encoded knowledge or deliberate warnings. This approach misunderstands the nature of the signals. The texts do not encode future catastrophes, they document past corrections. Those corrections are not predictive in detail, they are predictive in structure. If the same structural conditions arise, similar outcomes follow. This makes signs difficult to recognize because they do not point forward clearly, they point backward consistently. Human cognition is poorly suited to this kind of signal. We are attuned to novelty, not repetition. We notice what breaks pattern, not what fulfills it. As a result, the most reliable indicators of imbalance are often ignored until they become unavoidable. The Sumerian worldview accepts this limitation. It does not expect humanity to recognize signs early. It records what happens when recognition arrives too late. This perspective reframes the absence of obvious divine communication. The signs were never meant to be understood as guidance. They were meant to be experienced as outcome. In such a system, awareness is optional. Function is not. The Anunnaki, as observers rather than instructors, would have no reason to ensure that signs are legible. Legibility would interfere with observation. It would change behavior in anticipation rather than revealing behavior in ignorance. This explains why societies often repeat mistakes despite access to historical knowledge. Knowing what happened before does not feel relevant when current conditions feel different. Each civilization believes it has transcended the limitations of its predecessors. The pattern repeats not because humanity fails to learn, but because learning does not translate across scale. What works at one level of complexity fails at another. Expansion creates conditions that invalidate previous solutions. Signs emerge at the point where solutions stop working. These signs are not dramatic at first. They appear as friction, delays, shortages, tensions. They are easily rationalized, easily dismissed, easily postponed. Only when multiple forms of friction converge do they become impossible to ignore. By then, the window for gradual adjustment has often closed. From within the system, this feels like sudden crisis. From outside it, it is delayed response. The Sumerian texts never portray the gods as impatient. Correction arrives only after long tolerance. Silence persists until imbalance becomes structural rather than situational. This tolerance is often mistaken for indifference. It is not. It is calibration. If oversight intervened too early, systems would never reveal their true limits. They would survive through constant adjustment rather than intrinsic stability. The absence of obvious signs therefore allows systems to test themselves fully. This applies not only to civilizations, but to institutions, technologies, and cultural norms. Practices persist until their costs outweigh their benefits. That point is rarely obvious in advance. The signs that indicate this shift are often internal rather than external. Loss of trust, decline in cohesion, short-term thinking replacing long-term planning. These are not events, they are tendencies. Tendencies are difficult to measure. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate quietly. From an observational standpoint, tendencies are more informative than events. Events can be anomalies. Tendencies reveal direction. If the Anunnaki were still watching, these tendencies would matter more than isolated crises. A single disaster does not indicate imbalance. Repeated disregard for consequence does. This explains why intervention, when it occurs in myth, often feels disproportionate. From within the system, the triggering event seems insufficient to justify the outcome. From outside, it's merely the final indicator in a long series. The signs were present all along. They were just not meant to be recognized as signs. They were meant to be experienced as normal conditions until they could no longer be sustained. Human cultures often respond to this realization by searching for blame. Leaders, enemies, fate, or divine punishment are invoked. Rarely is the structure itself examined. The Sumerian worldview is less forgiving. It implies that imbalance produces outcome regardless of intent. Ignorance does not exempt systems from consequence. This does not mean oversight is hostile. It means oversight is indifferent to explanation. The signs that matter are not messages to be decoded. They are feedback loops that close. The difficulty in recognizing them is not a flaw in the system. It is a feature. Recognition too early would alter behavior. Recognition too late ensures resolution. This is why obvious signs are unreliable. They provoke reaction rather than reflection. Subtle signs accumulate silently. They shape trajectory without demanding attention. If oversight were still present, its most reliable indicators would be the things humanity dismisses as normal until they become unbearable. The steady erosion of resilience, the normalization of excess, the assumption that adaptation will always arrive in time. These are not warnings, they are conditions. The Sumerian texts do not instruct humanity to avoid these conditions. They record what follows when they persist. In a world convinced of its independence, signs that were never meant to be obvious are the only ones that can function without disrupting autonomy. They do not guide, they confirm, they do not instruct, they reveal. And they do not appear as messages from outside the system, but as expressions of the system itself reaching the limits of what it can absorb without correction. As the narrative continues, attention turns toward why such signs are so consistently misread, and how silence, distance, and autonomy combine to ensure that recognition almost always arrives after the point where gentle adjustment is possible, leaving only outcomes that feel sudden, overwhelming, and inexplicable to those living through them. At a certain point, explanation stops serving its original purpose. Early texts explain because explanation stabilizes. It tells people how the world works, what forces shape it, and where responsibility lies. Explanation builds coherence in a system that is still forming. But once that coherence becomes assumed, explanation becomes redundant. Worse, it becomes disruptive. The oldest Mesopotamian texts reflect this shift not as a decision, but as a change in necessity. They stop explaining not because knowledge is lost, but because explanation is no longer required to keep the system running. In the earlier Sumerian compositions, gods speak, argue, assign roles, and justify actions. Creation narratives are explicit. Divine hierarchies are laid out carefully. Functions are named. Boundaries are clarified. These texts are instructional because the world they describe is still close to its point of origin. The audience needs to understand how order was established in order to live within it. As time moves forward, that need diminishes. The structure has been internalized. People no longer require constant narrative reinforcement to believe that the world is ordered. They live inside the order daily. Explanation, once essential, becomes background noise. This is where hinting begins. Hinting is not incomplete explanation. It is a different mode of communication entirely. It assumes shared context. It relies on implication rather than declaration. It expects the reader to already understand the framework well enough to fill in gaps without assistance. The shift from explanation to hinting in the text coincides with the withdrawal of direct divine presence. When gods stop acting visibly, there is less to explain. Outcomes still occur, but their causes are no longer narrated. The connection between action and consequence stretches across time. Writing adapts to reflect this distance. Later texts do not describe divine decision-making processes. They record results. A city falls. A king loses favour. A dynasty ends. The reason is rarely spelled out. The reader is expected to infer it. This expectation is not arrogance. It is efficiency. Explanation is costly. It takes space, time, and authority. Hinting preserves meaning while reducing narrative intrusion. From a systemic perspective, this makes sense. Once oversight becomes observational rather than instructional, explanation would interfere with what is being observed. Clarifying intent alters behaviour. Ambiguity preserves authenticity. The Anunnaki's diminishing narrative presence fits this pattern precisely. Early references situate them clearly within divine genealogy and function. Later references assume their role without elaboration. They become background forces rather than characters. This does not indicate confusion about who they were. It indicates confidence. Confidence allows compression. Compression produces silence. The texts stop explaining because explanation would suggest uncertainty. They start hinting because certainty is assumed. This is uncomfortable for modern readers who rely on explicit causality. We expect texts to guide interpretation. We want reasons to be stated clearly. But ancient audiences did not share this expectation. They lived closer to the systems the text described. They did not need reassurance that balance existed. They experienced it daily through consequence. Hinting also allows multiple layers of meaning to coexist. Explanation fixes interpretation. Hinting preserves flexibility. As societies change, hinted meanings can be reinterpreted without rewriting the entire framework. This adaptability is essential in long-lived cultures. Explicit explanations age poorly. They become outdated as conditions change. Hints remain relevant because they do not specify mechanisms, only relationships. The Sumerian worldview values this durability. Fate, balance, and consequence are not tied to particular technologies or political structures. They operate regardless of context. Hinting communicates this universality more effectively than explanation ever could. This is why later texts feel fragmentary to modern readers. They are not incomplete. They are economical. They speak to an audience that already understands the underlying assumptions. The absence of explanation is not ignorance. It is trust. The writers trust that the reader knows how the world works well enough to recognize implication. This trust extends to divine behavior. When God stops speaking directly, texts reflect that silence. They do not invent new explanations to fill the gap. They allow the silence to stand. This restraint is deliberate. Filling silence with explanation would misrepresent reality. as the writers experienced it. The world felt ordered but opaque. Consequence arrived without warning. Fate unfolded without justification. The texts mirror that experience. This is also why later myths become more symbolic. Symbols can carry meaning without explanation. They gesture toward ideas rather than defining them. They function as reminders rather than instructions. The Anunnaki in this phase are rarely named directly. When they are, their role is assumed rather than described. They are invoked as judges, not as actors. Their presence is felt through outcome, not narrative. Hinting also protects authority. Explanation invites debate. If reasons are stated, they can be questioned. If processes are revealed, they can be challenged. Silence avoids this problem entirely. This is not deception, it is insulation. A system that relies on explanation is vulnerable to reinterpretation. A system that relies on outcome is not. The Sumerian texts show an increasing reliance on outcome. Kings are judged by prosperity or failure, not by divine speeches. Cities are favoured or abandoned based on results, not on stated reasons. This shift aligns with the broader movement from rule to observation. Explanation belongs to rule. Hinting belongs to observation. Observation requires ambiguity. It requires the observed to act without knowing precisely what is being measured. The texts stop explaining because explanation would collapse the distance that observation requires. This distance is essential for long-term assessment. Without it, behaviour becomes strategic rather than authentic. Hinting preserves uncertainty. Uncertainty preserves honesty. This also explains why later readers misinterpret the texts as contradictory or incomplete. They are reading them as manuals rather than records. They expect answers where the text offers orientation. The orientation is subtle but consistent. Balance matters. Excess accumulates. Silence precedes correction. Outcome resolves ambiguity. These principles are not explained because they do not need to be. They are demonstrated repeatedly. The texts trust repetition more than clarification. Repetition teaches without speaking. This pedagogical approach assumes a different relationship between reader and text. The reader is not a novice. The reader is a participant. Ancient audiences lived inside the system the text described. Modern readers observe it from outside. That distance makes hinting feel inadequate. But within its original context, hinting was sufficient. It also allowed sacred text to coexist with practical reality. When explanation stops matching experience, credibility erodes. Hinting avoids this risk. It accommodates variance. This is particularly important for divine narratives. Gods who explain too much risk being proven wrong by events. Gods who remain silent remain credible. The Anunnaki's transition into hinted presences rather than explained figures preserves their authority. They are no longer subject to narrative verification. They exist beyond description. This makes them harder to dismiss, not easier. A fully explained god can be disproven. A hinted one cannot. This is why the soft erasure of direct contact coincides with the rise of implication. Memory becomes selective. Narrative becomes compressed. Explanation gives way to illusion. The system does not need clarity. It needs continuity. Hinting ensures continuity without interference. From the perspective of oversight, this is ideal. The text reflects the system rather than attempting to control interpretation. Silence in explanation mirrors silence in divine behaviour. Both signal that the framework is stable enough to operate without commentary. Human discomfort with this silence does not invalidate it. It confirms it. We expect explanation because we fear uncertainty. Ancient systems accepted uncertainty as a condition of existence. The Sumerian texts do not promise understanding. They promise order. Understanding is optional. Order is not. This is why later compositions feel distant, austere, and restrained. They are not concerned with persuasion. They are concerned with record. They stop explaining because explanation would suggest that something is still unsettled. They start hinting because what remains unsettled is not the system, but human interpretation of it. That distinction is critical. The texts are not confused, the readers are, and that confusion is not accidental. It reflects the very distance that observation requires. As the narrative moves forward, this pattern becomes more pronounced. Explanation fades further, implication deepens, silence expands. What remains is a record that does not tell humanity what to think, but shows it what happens. And in that showing, the absence of explanation becomes its own form of communication, one that does not instruct, does not warn, and does not persuade, but quietly reveals how much has already been decided by the time anyone starts asking for answers. Judgment in the earliest texts is never theatrical. It does not arrive with proclamations or spectacle. It is not announced in advance nor explained afterward. It is something that happens once a process has already concluded. That distinction becomes increasingly important as divine behaviour shifts from rule to observation and as silence replaces instruction. If judgment still exists in such a framework, it would not resemble the images that later traditions attach to the word. It would not look like condemnation or reward delivered in response to belief or disbelief. It would look like resolution. In the Sumerian worldview, judgment is inseparable from outcome. It is not an external act imposed on events. It is the moment when accumulated imbalance becomes unsustainable and the system corrects itself. The gods associated with judgment do not decide arbitrarily. They preside over inevitability. When early texts describe divine judgment, they do not focus on moral transgression in the modern sense. They focus on excess, noise, overreach, and disregard for limit. These are not sins. They are stresses placed on a system that has finite capacity. Judgment follows when stress exceeds tolerance. As direct divine intervention recedes, judgment does not vanish. It changes scale. Instead of appearing as localized punishment, it manifests as structural consequence. Entire systems fail rather than individuals being singled out. Cities collapse, networks fragment, stability dissolves. This shift is crucial. Judgment that operates at scale does not need to identify culprits. It resolves imbalance regardless of intent. Those within the system experience it as catastrophe. From outside the system, it appears as correction. If judgment still exists now, it would not arrive as a message or a verdict. It would arrive as a closing of options, as the sudden impossibility of continuing along a path that once seemed viable. This kind of judgment is difficult to recognize because it does not announce itself as judgment. It presents itself as crisis, failure, or inevitability. It feels secular rather than sacred. In earlier ages, judgment could be attributed directly to gods because the gods were still narratively present. Their actions were part of the story. In later ages, judgment loses its narrative voice. It becomes indistinguishable from circumstance. This does not make it less real. It makes it harder to personalize. The Anunnaki, understood as judges rather than rulers, would not need to adapt their function to changing human expectations. Judgment does not require relevance. It requires persistence. In a world where guidance has ended and autonomy has expanded, judgment becomes the only remaining form of interaction. But even that interaction is indirect. It occurs through the system itself. This reframes how judgment might operate now. It would not target belief, identity, or ideology. It would target structure. It would address the points where systems can no longer compensate for imbalance. In ancient texts, floods are not punishments for disbelief. They are resets triggered by accumulation. Noise becomes unbearable. Population exceeds limits. Balance collapses. Modern equivalents would follow the same logic. Not as floods necessarily, but as converging pressures that overwhelm adaptive capacity. Judgment in this sense would look like the simultaneous failure of systems that were assumed to be independent. Economic stress converging with environmental strain. political instability amplifying resource scarcity, social fragmentation accelerating technological risk. None of these elements alone constitute judgment. Together they represent saturation. From within the system, saturation feels sudden. From outside it, it is gradual. The delay between action and consequence creates the illusion that judgment is absent. The longer the delay, the stronger the illusion becomes. By the time resolution arrives, the original causes are often forgotten. This forgetfulness is not accidental. It is a byproduct of scale. Human attention is short. Systems operate slowly. The Sumerian worldview accepts this gap. It does not attempt to close it through warning. Warning would alter behavior prematurely. Judgment requires authenticity. If judgment still exists, it would preserve this gap. It would allow systems to reveal themselves fully before intervening. This also means judgment would not feel fair in a human sense. Fairness implies proportionality and clarity. Structural judgment is indifferent to fairness. It resolves imbalance regardless of who benefits or suffers. This indifference is often interpreted as cruelty. In ancient texts, gods are accused of capriciousness. But within the framework of balance, emotion is irrelevant. What matters is stability. Judgment restores stability by removing excess. That removal is rarely gentle. This perspective challenges modern expectations that oversight should be corrective rather than terminal. We expect systems to be guided back toward equilibrium gradually. The ancient framework allows for reset when gradual correction fails. If judgment still exists now, it would not seek to reform systems that have lost adaptability. It would replace them. Replacement does not require intention. It occurs when existing structures cannot respond effectively to stress. This makes judgment appear passive. It does not act. It allows collapse to occur. The Anunnaki's role as judges would fit this perfectly. They would not need to intervene. They would allow systems to reach their conclusions. This also explains why judgment, when it arrives, often feels misdirected. Those who suffer most are not always those who caused imbalance. Structural correction does not discriminate. It resolves conditions, not culpability. Ancient texts do not apologize for this. They record it. Judgment is not about justice. It is about continuity. A system that cannot sustain itself must end so that another can begin. If judgment still exists, it would likely manifest as endings that feel unjustified, because justification is not its function. Its function is resolution. This is deeply unsettling because it removes moral comfort. There is no assurance that good behavior guarantees safety. There is no promise that belief ensures protection. The Sumerian worldview never offered such assurances. Humanity exists within a framework that rewards balance and punishes excess, not virtue or faith. This framework persists regardless of interpretation. Judgment in this sense is not personal. It does not recognize individuals. It recognizes trajectories. If trajectories become unsustainable, judgment occurs. This reframes modern crises. Instead of asking who failed, the framework asks whether the system could have continued. When continuation is no longer possible, judgment has already happened. Collapse is merely its expression. This also explains why judgment often appears irreversible. Once thresholds are crossed, reversal requires resources and coordination that no longer exist. The point of no return is rarely obvious when it is passed. It becomes clear only afterward. Ancient texts reflect this inevitability. Floods do not stop halfway. Cities do not collapse gradually and then recover fully. Resets are decisive. If judgment still exists now, it would not announce itself. It would not explain itself. It would simply close paths that were once open. Humanity would experience this as shock, as disbelief, as confusion. From the perspective of oversight, it would be confirmation. The Anunnaki, as judges, would not appear at this moment. Appearance would add nothing. Their presence is implicit in the outcome. Judgment would not restore the old order. It would make space for something new. This aligns with the ancient pattern. After each reset, the world continues under different conditions. Lifespans shorten, access narrows, limits tighten. Progress does not reverse. It becomes constrained. If judgment still exists, it would not return humanity to a previous state. It would establish new parameters. This makes judgment forward-looking rather than punitive. It clears space rather than exacting revenge. The ancient texts never describe judgment as an end of history. They describe it as a boundary between phases. That boundary is not chosen, it is reached. Modern humanity often believes it can negotiate with limits through innovation or delay. Sometimes it can, sometimes it cannot. Judgment arrives when delay ceases to function. If judgment still exists now, it would not be visible as divine action. It would be indistinguishable from systemic failure. This indistinguishability is essential. It preserves autonomy until the last moment. It prevents panic. It allows systems to reveal their full structure before ending. The absence of obvious divine markers does not weaken judgment. It strengthens it. Those expecting signs miss the point. Judgment does not warn, it resolves. In this framework, the question is not whether judgment exists, but whether systems are still within tolerable bounds. Ancient texts suggest that tolerance can last far longer than humans expect. Silence persists until imbalance becomes undeniable. This long tolerance fuels confidence. Confidence fuels acceleration. Acceleration shortens the distance between imbalance and resolution. Judgment, when it arrives, feels sudden because silence was long. If the Anunnaki are still watching, judgment would not look like condemnation from above. It would look like the moment when complexity collapses under its own weight. It would not single out belief systems or cultures. It would affect structures that have outlived their capacity to adapt. This makes judgment impersonal, global, and difficult to interpret. Ancient societies explained it through gods because gods were the language of order. Modern societies explain it through systems because systems are the language of order now. The mechanism remains unchanged. Only the vocabulary shifts. Judgment still exists not as a sentence imposed but as a condition reached. It does not ask permission. It does not require acknowledgement. It does not seek understanding. It arrives when silence has done all it can, and by the time it is recognized as judgment, it has already finished its work, leaving humanity to interpret the aftermath as accident, fate, or inevitability, depending on which stories it still remembers and which it is allowed to fade. In a world that is watched but not guided, humanity occupies a position unlike anything imagined in later moral or religious systems. It is neither a child under instruction, nor a subject under rule. It is something closer to a variable within a larger structure, a force capable of altering conditions, accelerating outcomes, and pushing systems toward thresholds that would otherwise remain theoretical. The oldest texts do not flatter humanity in this role. They do not frame it as chosen or favoured. They frame it as consequential. Once direct intervention fades, humanity becomes the primary active agent in the visible world. The gods do not disappear, but their activity no longer overlaps with daily human decision-making. What remains is a framework within which human action carries weight far beyond individual intention. In such a system, humanity is not evaluated for obedience, but for impact. This distinction is critical. Obedience is only meaningful when rules are explicit and enforced. Impact matters when freedom is real. The Sumerian worldview transitions decisively from the former to the latter. Humans are no longer constantly corrected. They are allowed to act, expand, build, exploit, organize, and destroy within limits that are no longer explained but still enforced. In this watched world, humanity's role is not to perform virtue or maintain ritual purity. Those concerns belong to periods of rule. Humanity's role becomes simpler and more demanding at the same time. It becomes the bearer of consequence. What humans do now shapes conditions that will persist long after individual actors are gone. This is why later texts focus so heavily on kings, cities, and lineages rather than individuals. The scale of relevance shifts upward. Single actions matter less than sustained patterns. A single injustice is insignificant compared to a system that normalizes exploitation. A single innovation is irrelevant compared to a culture that accelerates change without restraint. The Watchers, if they exist, would not be interested in intentions. Intentions are fleeting. They're easy to manipulate and difficult to verify. Systems, by contrast, reveal priorities reliably. What a society chooses to preserve, what it sacrifices, what it accelerates, and what it ignores provides far more information than any declaration of belief. Humanity, in this context, becomes a mirror rather than a student. It reflects the values embedded in its structures. The watched world does not ask humans to be good, it allows them to be honest. This honesty is often mistaken for progress. As oversight becomes invisible, humanity assumes responsibility for defining success. Metrics replace meaning. Growth becomes a goal rather than a consequence. Expansion is pursued for its own sake. From within the system, this feels empowering. Humanity appears to be shaping its own destiny. From outside it, something else becomes visible. The same patterns repeat regardless of culture or era. Concentration of power, resource exhaustion, social fragmentation, decline. The role humanity plays is therefore not passive. It actively tests the resilience of the framework it inhabits. Each generation pushes boundaries inherited from the last, often without awareness that those boundaries exist at all. In the Sumerian worldview, this testing is not condemned. It is expected. A system that cannot be tested cannot be assessed. Autonomy is not a gift. It is a condition for evaluation. This reframes the idea of being watched. Watching does not imply concern for individual well-being. It implies interest in systemic behavior. Humanity's role is to generate that behavior without interference. The silence that surrounds this role is essential. If humans were aware of being watched continuously, behavior would shift toward appeasement. Performance would replace authenticity. The data would be corrupted. By believing itself alone, humanity behaves as it truly is. This belief produces remarkable outcomes. Art, science, technology, and philosophy flourish. So do warfare, exploitation, and environmental destruction. The watched world does not privilege one outcome over the other, it records both. From a human-centered perspective, this feels unfair. We prefer a universe that rewards effort and punishes wrongdoing clearly. The ancient framework does not operate that way. It is indifferent to moral narrative. It responds to balance. Humanity's role, then, is not to be judged for its beliefs, but for the sustainability of its systems. When systems are stable, silence continues. When they are not, silence ends. This makes humanity both powerful and fragile. Powerful because it can reshape the world without immediate constraint. Fragile because it often mistakes short-term success for long-term viability. The watched world does not intervene to correct this mistake. It allows it to unfold. This allowance creates a strange ethical landscape. Responsibility is absolute, but guidance is absent. Humanity must infer limits rather than being told them. Failure to infer correctly carries consequences that are not explained. The Sumerian texts do not present this as cruelty. They present it as order. A system that explains itself endlessly never reveals whether it works. A system that allows failure reveals its limits clearly. Humanity, in this role, becomes an experiment it does not know it is participating in. Not an experiment in morality or belief, but in scale and complexity. How much can a self-directed system grow before it destabilizes itself? How quickly does innovation outpace adaptation? How long can balance be maintained without awareness of boundaries? These questions are never asked directly in the texts. They are demonstrated. The watched world is not one where humanity is secretly protected. It is one where humanity is allowed to be consequential. Its actions matter not because they are noticed, but because they accumulate. This accumulation is slow and often invisible. Each generation inherits conditions shaped by previous choices. Few recognize the continuity. Most interpret their moment as exceptional. The watchers, if present, would recognize the continuity easily. Distance collapses novelty. Patterns become obvious. From that vantage, humanity's role is not mysterious. It is consistent. Humans build systems that reflect their priorities. Those systems either adapt or collapse. Belief in being alone accelerates risk-taking. It encourages exploitation of resources assumed to be inexhaustible. It normalizes inequality if it produces growth. It justifies expansion without consideration of consequence. These behaviors are not punished immediately. That delay reinforces confidence. Confidence fuels acceleration. Acceleration tests limits. The role humanity plays is therefore active, not submissive. It is the driver of its own conditions. The watched world does not steer. It observes. This observation is not judgment in itself. It is preparation for judgment if it becomes necessary. Humanity often assumes that oversight, if it exists, must care about human suffering. The ancient framework does not support this assumption. Oversight cares about stability. Suffering is relevant only insofar as it destabilizes systems. This is a difficult idea to accept. It strips comfort from belief. It replaces reassurance with accountability. But it also grants humanity a form of dignity rarely acknowledged. Humans are not treated as children. They are treated as forces. The watched world allows humanity to discover what it's capable of when left alone. That discovery includes both creation and destruction. This silence surrounding this role is therefore not neglect. It is respect of a particular kind. It allows humanity to define itself fully before being evaluated. The Sumerian texts never ask whether this arrangement is fair. They assume it is inevitable. Humanity's role is not to escape observation, but to live within it without awareness. That lack of awareness is the condition under which genuine behavior emerges. This makes the watched world feel empty and vast. Gods fade. Meaning becomes human-made. History accelerates, and yet beneath that acceleration something steady remains. A structure that measures consequence, records imbalance, and waits. Humanity's role in that structure is not symbolic. It is functional. What humans do matters not because it is seen, but because it changes the conditions under which future action will occur. In a watched world, humanity is not judged by what it claims to value, but by what it builds, preserves, and exhausts. This role carries no promise of rescue. It carries no guarantee of correction. It carries only the certainty that accumulation leads somewhere. The ancient texts do not resolve where that somewhere is. They only show that silence lasts until it can no longer do its work. As the narrative moves forward, the tension between freedom and consequence becomes sharper. Humanity grows more convinced of its independence. The watched world grows quieter, and within that quiet, the space between action and outcome narrows, setting the stage for the final questions that do not ask whether anyone is watching, but what it means to continue acting as if no one is. Freedom is easiest to believe in when nothing interrupts it. When choices lead to immediate reward and delayed consequence, autonomy feels absolute. The absence of visible oversight becomes evidence of independence. Humanity learns quickly to equate silence with permission, distance with abandonment, and lack of correction with control. Over time, this belief solidifies into something deeper than confidence. It becomes assumption. An assumption shapes behavior more powerfully than instruction ever could. The Sumerian texts never describe freedom as a granted state. They describe it as a condition that emerges when guidance recedes. Choice expands not because limits vanish, but because awareness of limits fades. This distinction is subtle and easy to miss. Freedom, in this framework, is not the removal of boundaries, it is the loss of sensitivity to them. Choice multiplies in such an environment. Without visible consequence, every option appears viable. Without immediate correction, risk feels manageable. Humanity begins to treat the world as open-ended, a space defined more by opportunity than constraint. This is where the illusion of absence takes hold. When God stops speaking, humanity does not conclude that they are watching silently. It concludes that they are gone. This conclusion is not irrational. It is experiential. Absence of interaction feels like absence of presence. Over generations, this feeling hardens into worldview. The illusion is not that oversight has ended. The illusion is that oversight ever depended on interaction in the first place. Freedom, under this illusion, becomes expansive. Human systems grow more ambitious. Technologies scale faster than ethics. Institutions prioritize efficiency over resilience. Expansion becomes its own justification. From within this mindset, restraint feels unnecessary. Limits feel negotiable. Warnings feel abstract. The watched world becomes indistinguishable from an unwatched one. Choice, in this context, does not disappear. It intensifies. Humanity chooses not just how to live, but what kind of world to build. It chooses which consequences to defer, which risks to normalize, which costs to externalize. These choices are rarely framed as choices. They are framed as inevitabilities, necessities, progress. The illusion of absence makes this framing possible. If no one is watching, then responsibility feels distributed, diluted, or theoretical. Accountability becomes internal rather than external. Systems answer only to themselves. This is where freedom becomes dangerous, not because freedom is flawed, but because it operates without reference. Choice without reference drifts toward excess. It does not self-correct easily. It requires feedback. In a silent world, feedback arrives late. The Sumerian worldview anticipates this outcome. It does not warn against freedom. It records what happens when freedom operates without awareness of constraint. Illusion is central to this process. Humanity does not choose recklessness knowingly. It chooses growth, comfort, security, and advantage. Recklessness emerges as a byproduct. The absence of visible oversight removes friction from decision-making. Actions feel lighter. Consequences feel distant. The future feels abstract. This abstraction encourages scale. Small systems fail quickly and visibly. Large systems fail slowly and invisibly. The illusion of absence persists longer in complex systems because failure takes time to manifest. This delay reinforces confidence. Each generation inherits a world that still functions and assumes its choices are validated by that functioning. The illusion deepens. Freedom becomes identity. Humanity begins to define itself by its independence. Myths of self-creation replace memories of structure. The idea that limits are external or imposed fades. Limits are seen as technical problems rather than structural realities. Choice, in this frame, becomes limitless in theory. Anything not explicitly prevented is assumed possible. The watched world does not correct this assumption. Correction would shatter the illusion prematurely. It would distort behavior. Instead, silence persists. This silence allows freedom to reach its full expression. Humanity explores what it will do when it believes nothing is watching. It reveals what it values when no one is expected to intervene. This revelation is not immediate. It accumulates slowly. Patterns emerge over centuries, not years. The illusion of absence also reshapes morality. Ethical systems become self-referential. Right and wrong are determined by consensus, utility or power rather than alignment with unseen structure. Morality becomes flexible, adaptable, contextual. This flexibility is often framed as maturity, and in many ways it is. Humanity learns to navigate complexity without divine instruction. But flexibility without boundary awareness creates fragility. When everything is negotiable, nothing is anchored. The Sumerian texts do not condemn this shift. They simply show that it leads somewhere specific. Freedom without perceived oversight accelerates differentiation. Societies diverge rapidly. Some prioritize stability, others prioritize expansion. Some invest in continuity, others in dominance. These divergences are informative. They reveal how different systems behave under identical illusions. Choice, in a watched world mistaken for an empty one, becomes the engine of history. Humanity writes its own trajectory without realizing it is still constrained by conditions it no longer remembers. This is why absence feels empowering. It removes the psychological weight of being evaluated. It frees action from scrutiny. But evaluation does not require awareness. The illusion of absence is therefore not harmless. It is functional. It enables behavior that could not occur under visible oversight. The watched world needs this illusion to function as an assessment environment. Without it, humanity would behave cautiously, strategically, performatively. With it, humanity behaves authentically. This authenticity includes creativity, compassion, cruelty, ingenuity, and disregard in equal measure. It is not filtered. From an observational perspective, this is valuable. It reveals the true operating principles of human systems. Freedom and choice under this illusion are not revoked. They are exercised fully. The cost of this exercise is delayed feedback. The reward is rapid development. The Sumerian worldview accepts this trade-off. It does not promise safety, it allows outcome. Humanity often seeks reassurance that freedom will not lead to collapse. The ancient framework offers no such reassurance. It suggests that freedom reveals whether collapse is inevitable. The illusion of absence also explains why warnings are so often ignored. Warnings imply oversight. They suggest that someone knows better. In a world convinced of its independence, such suggestions are resisted. Evidence is preferred to caution. Proof is demanded after failure, not before. Silence accommodates this preference. Choice continues unimpeded until choice itself becomes constrained by circumstance. At that point, freedom contracts suddenly. Options disappear. Paths close. From within the system, this contraction feels unjust. From outside, it is structural. The illusion of absence collapses only when limits become undeniable. Until then, it remains intact, reinforced by functioning systems and delayed consequence. The Sumerian texts do not frame this collapse as betrayal. They frame it as arrival. Freedom and choice are not removed arbitrarily. They encounter boundaries that were always present but unacknowledged. This encounter feels like loss because the illusion made those boundaries invisible. In a watched world, the greatest freedom humanity has is the freedom to misunderstand silence. That misunderstanding fuels history. It drives expansion, innovation, and conflict. It shapes civilizations that believe they are unobserved, and it ensures that when correction finally arrives, it is experienced not as guidance returned, but as freedom abruptly withdrawn. The illusion of absence allows humanity to define itself fully. It also ensures that definition will eventually be tested. The ancient texts do not resolve this tension. They record it. They show a world where freedom grows alongside ignorance of constraint, where choice expands without awareness of consequence, and where silence allows humanity to believe it stands alone at the center of history. That belief persists until it no longer can. As the narrative continues, attention turns toward what happens when the illusion begins to fracture, not through revelation or awakening, but through the slow accumulation of limits that make freedom feel suddenly conditional again, forcing humanity to confront whether absence was ever real, or simply the space in which its true nature was allowed to unfold. If they never truly looked away, then the long silence was never abandonment, and the absence humanity learned to trust was never emptiness. It was distance. That distinction changes everything. not because it introduces something new into the world, but because it reframes everything that has already happened within it. A watched world that believes itself alone behaves very differently from one that knows it is observed. And a watched world that never realizes the difference reveals far more than one that does. The idea that oversight never ended does not require constant attention or continuous monitoring. It requires continuity. It requires that nothing essential was dismantled when divine presence faded from daily life. Structures remained, thresholds remained, consequence remained, only awareness diminished. From this perspective, the most significant event in human history was not the departure of gods, but humanity's gradual certainty that no one was watching closely anymore. That certainty shaped behavior far more powerfully than any command ever did. If the Anunnaki never looked away, then silence was not a pause between actions. It was the action. Watching without intervening allowed humanity to operate at full scale, unrestricted by fear of immediate correction. This does not imply interest in individual lives. Observation at this level is not personal, it is systemic. What matters are trajectories, not moments, patterns, not incidents, direction, not intention. From such a vantage, history compresses. Centuries become manageable units. Civilizations appear as experiments in organization, extraction, belief, and power. Their differences matter less than their similarities. If watching continued, then the repetition of collapse across cultures is not coincidence, it is confirmation. Different societies operating independently reach similar outcomes when they encounter similar pressures. The watchers would not need to intervene to learn this. The pattern is self-evident. This reframes the meaning of progress. Progress is not measured by technological advancement or cultural sophistication. It is measured by whether systems remain stable as they scale. If complexity increases faster than resilience, collapse follows regardless of intent. If they never looked away, then every period of apparent success was provisional. Growth was tolerated, not endorsed. Expansion was allowed, not protected. This idea removes comfort from the narrative of human exceptionalism. It suggests that no civilization is exempt from evaluation simply because it is advanced, enlightened, or powerful. Stability is the only metric that matters. The Anunnaki, understood as judges of balance, would not be impressed by innovation alone. Innovation that accelerates imbalance would register as risk, not achievement. From within history, this feels unfair. We want recognition for effort. We want credit for ingenuity. But oversight concerned with balance does not respond to effort. It responds to outcome. If they never looked away, then humanity's belief in its own independence becomes the central variable under observation. What happens when a species capable of altering planetary conditions believes no external constraint exists? The answer unfolds slowly. Resource use intensifies. Long-term costs are deferred. Short-term gains dominate decision-making. Systems prioritize speed over durability. These behaviors are not malicious. They are logical under the illusion of absence. Watching such a process requires patience. Intervening too early would invalidate the data. Allowing the process to continue reveals its endpoint naturally. If oversight never ceased, then the absence of intervention is not indifference. It is confirmation that the system has not yet reached a point where correction is unavoidable. This interpretation casts silence as confidence in the framework rather than neglect of its occupants. It also casts judgment as something that has not yet been triggered, rather than something that has been abandoned. If they never looked away, then judgment is not delayed because it has been forgotten. It is delayed because it has not yet become necessary. This does not imply safety. It implies tolerance. Tolerance has limits. The unsettling implication is that humanity may be closer to those limits than it realizes, precisely because the illusion of absence encourages acceleration. In a watched world, the most dangerous belief is that nothing beyond the system matters. That belief encourages exploitation of everything within reach. If oversight continues, then belief is irrelevant. Whether humanity acknowledges watchers or dismisses them as myth changes nothing about how systems behave under stress. The watchers would not require recognition to function. Recognition would only distort behaviour. If they never looked away, then myths fading into abstraction was not a failure of memory. It was a success of distance. Distance ensured that observation remained uncontaminated. This also means that humanity's greatest test was not belief, obedience, or morality. It was sustainability. Could a self-directed species maintain balance without awareness of constraint? History suggests that this is difficult. Collapse does not occur because of malice. It occurs because systems grow faster than their capacity to regulate themselves. If they never looked away, then collapse is not punishment. It is diagnosis. Diagnosis does not moralize. It identifies failure modes. Once identified, those modes do not need to be explained again. They are known. This interpretation also alters the meaning of hope. Hope is often framed as rescue, intervention, or correction from outside. In a watched world, hope exists only within the system. Adaptation must occur before thresholds are crossed. After thresholds are crossed, hope becomes irrelevant. Resolution follows. If they never looked away, then the silence that has defined human history is not an absence of concern. It is a condition of evaluation. Humanity has been allowed to reveal itself fully. The Anunnaki, if still watching, would not intervene to save civilizations from themselves. Doing so would prevent understanding of whether such civilizations were capable of restraint. This does not mean intervention will never occur. It means intervention is not corrective. It is terminal. The ancient texts are clear on this point. When correction arrives, it does not restore the old order. It replaces it. This is why judgment is feared. It does not negotiate. If they never looked away, then humanity's current moment is not unique. It is familiar. Other civilizations reached similar levels of complexity and confidence. They believed themselves secure. They assumed absence meant freedom. They were wrong. Not because they were punished, but because they misunderstood silence. The watched world does not demand humility. It reveals the consequences of its absence. If they never looked away, then every choice humanity makes contributes to a record that does not care how choices were justified. The record does not track intentions. It tracks impact. This makes the question of awareness irrelevant. Knowing one is watched does not change the thresholds. It only changes behavior. The thresholds exist regardless. If humanity continues to behave as if no one is watching, the outcome will not be surprising to those who observe from a distance. It will only be surprising to those inside the system who believed silence meant safety. The possibility that they never looked away does not require belief in ancient beings. It requires recognition that systems larger than individual awareness exist, and that those systems operate independently of narrative. Whether those systems are conceptualized as gods, laws of nature, or structural constraints does not change their function. The Anunnaki are a name given to a role, not necessarily to entities. If that role persists, then watching has never stopped. What would it mean if they never truly looked away? It would mean that humanity has always been free to act, but never free from consequence. It would mean that silence was never a gap, only a mirror. It would mean that the most important judgments have not yet been delivered, not because they were forgotten, but because the conditions that trigger them were still forming. And it would mean that the story humanity tells itself about being alone may be the most influential myth it has ever created, one that shaped behaviour for thousands of years without ever needing to be true. From here, the narrative moves not toward revelation or fear, but toward a quieter question, one that does not ask who is watching, but what it means to live as if being watched makes no difference at all. The idea of being seen without knowing it is unsettling only if being seen is imagined as judgment in the human sense. We associate observation with scrutiny, exposure, and evaluation that demands response. We imagine eyes that expect acknowledgement, presence that requires reaction. But the older framework suggested by the text points to something quieter, colder, and far more patient than that. Being seen, in this context, is not an event, it is a condition. One that does not intrude, does not announce itself, and does not require awareness to function. When the world grows quiet at night, when movement slows and attention drifts inward, it becomes easier to imagine that nothing is paying attention. Silence feels complete then. The absence of interruption feels like proof that nothing exists beyond immediate experience. But silence has never been evidence of emptiness. In the oldest traditions, silence is simply the state in which systems reveal themselves most clearly. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the earliest Sumerian understanding, were never intimate companions. They were not gods who walked among humans for comfort or guidance. They were associated with fate, judgment, and long spans of time that exceeded individual awareness. Their attention was not directed at moments, but at trajectories, not at thoughts, but at outcomes. To be seen in that sense is not to be watched as an individual watches another. It is to exist within a structure that records consequence whether or not it is acknowledged. A mountain does not watch a river erode it, but erosion still occurs. A system does not need consciousness in the human sense to measure change. It only needs persistence. This is why the idea of being seen without knowing it does not demand fear. Fear belongs to systems of control that rely on intimidation. What the ancient framework describes is not intimidation, but inevitability. It does not threaten, it waits. Humanity, over thousands of years, has learned to interpret waiting as absence. The longer silence lasts, the more complete the illusion becomes. Generations are born into a world that appears self-contained. Gods recede into myth. Myths recede into story. Stories recede into culture. Eventually, even the idea that something once watched closely becomes faint. What remains is confidence. Confidence that the world operates according to human intention alone. Confidence that limits are technical problems rather than structural ones. Confidence that whatever consequences exist can be managed through ingenuity or delay. That confidence is not irrational. It is earned through long periods of functioning systems and deferred feedback. Silence rewards confidence with continuity, reinforcing the belief that nothing beyond the visible world matters. And yet, being seen does not require belief. The quiet thought before sleep is not meant to disturb rest. It is not meant to provoke vigilance or anxiety. It is simply an acknowledgement of scale. The recognition that human awareness occupies only a narrow band of time and perception, while the structures that shape outcome operate across spans far longer than a single life. In such a context, being seen is indistinguishable from being part of a process. It does not single one out. It does not track moral worth or intention. It observes accumulation. Every generation inherits conditions shaped by choices it did not make. Infrastructure, climate, culture, inequality, and opportunity are all legacies of prior behavior. These legacies are not judgments in themselves. They are records. The watched world, if it exists, does not add to those records. It does not need to. Humanity writes them continuously. This reframes the meaning of visibility. What matters is not whether actions are noticed in the moment, but whether they alter conditions in ways that persist. Most actions do not. Some do profoundly. Being seen without knowing it means that the impact of those actions is not erased by forgetfulness. Memory may fade. Myth may distort. Explanation may stop. But structure remains. The ancient texts never suggest that oversight is interested in awareness. Awareness complicates observation. It introduces performance, justification, and distortion. Genuine behavior emerges only when subjects believe they are unobserved. This is why silence is essential. It preserves authenticity. From this perspective, the long history of human confidence, expansion and overreach is not a failure of oversight. It is its function. It allows humanity to demonstrate what it does when left to itself. The quiet thought here is not about doom or expectation. It is about humility of scale, the recognition that human narratives are short while systemic processes are long. Being seen without knowing it does not mean being judged for every action. It means being part of a pattern that will eventually resolve according to rules that do not negotiate with explanation. This can feel cold, but it is also stabilizing. It suggests that chaos is not arbitrary. That collapse, when it occurs, follows structure. That continuity, when it persists, does so because balance remains intact. The absence of divine voice does not imply abandonment. It implies that the framework no longer needs reinforcement through speech. In the quiet before sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on urgency, it becomes easier to accept that not everything requires explanation. Some things simply continue until they cannot. Human history is filled with moments where confidence met boundary. Those moments are often remembered as tragedy or mystery. Rarely are they remembered as confirmation of underlying structure. The Sumerian worldview did not romanticize those moments. It accepted them. The world resets when it must. Life continues under new constraints. Silence returns. Being seen without knowing it also removes the burden of performance. There is no need to appease, persuade, or impress. There is no audience to satisfy. There is only consequence. This shifts responsibility inward rather than upward. It places weight not on belief, but on construction. Not on intention, but on effect. In a watched world mistaken for an empty one, humanity's greatest influence is not what it believes, but what it builds and sustains. The quiet thought before sleep is not a warning. It is an orientation, a reminder that silence has never been proof of absence, and that freedom has never been proof of immunity. Being seen without knowing it means that nothing needs to be dramatized. There are no signs to interpret, no messages to decode, no revelations to await. Life continues, systems accumulate, outcomes approach. The ancient texts do not ask humanity to fear this. They ask humanity to recognize it, though even recognition is not required for the system to function. The quiet is enough. As sleep approaches, there is no need to resolve the question of who watches or how. Those questions belong to waking curiosity. What matters in the quiet is simpler. Whatever exists beyond human awareness does not rush. It does not interrupt rest. It does not intrude on thought. It waits. And waiting, over long spans of time, has always been the most reliable form of attention there is. The world slows, the noise fades, the illusion of urgency softens. Whether watched or not, the structures remain. And that is enough to let the mind rest, knowing that nothing needs to be done in response to the quiet, because the quiet has always been there, holding everything in place long before anyone thought to look for it.